My 11-year-old niece had just survived the man who was supposed to protect her. She lay beneath a hospital blanket, awake but frighteningly still, flinching whenever footsteps passed the door. When I called her name, her lips moved, but no sound came. Then my sister looked at her own daughter and said, "I won't waste my life raising a broken child." She walked out with the man who had hurt her. That night, Iris grabbed my hand and wrote, "If I can't talk, will you still want me?" I said yes. 10 years later, at a billionaire's wedding, the mother who abandoned her finally heard the voice she thought she had silenced forever. Before I tell you how we reached that wedding, I hope you're doing well wherever you're listening from. Stay with me, because what happened after that hospital room changed all three of our lives in ways none of us understood yet. And if stories about family, courage, and the people who choose to stay mean something to you, you're always welcome to subscribe and listen along. The call came just after lunch on a Wednesday in May 2016. I was 34 then, working as an operations manager for a regional library and community services system in Denver. My days were usually built from things I could organize: maintenance requests, staff schedules, public rooms that needed to open on time, budgets that had to balance by the end of the month. That afternoon, I was standing beside a copier that had jammed for the third time when my phone vibrated against the counter. By the end of the call, someone was asking whether I was still there, and I was staring at a half-printed page without understanding a single word on it. Iris had been taken to the hospital. She was alive. She was stable enough that nobody was telling me to prepare for the worst. Those were the only facts I managed to hold on to during the drive. I knew there had been problems inside my sister Valerie's marriage. Everyone in the family knew Damon could be controlling. He corrected Valerie in front of people, decided when conversations were over, and had a way of turning disagreements into lectures until everybody else became too tired to continue. But families are dangerously talented at grading the behavior they can see while remaining ignorant of what happens after the front door closes. I had seen enough to dislike him. I had not seen enough to understand what Iris had been living inside. Traffic crawled toward the hospital under a bright Colorado sky that seemed almost offensive in its normalcy. People changed lanes. A man in the car beside me drank something through a straw. 2 teenagers laughed at a bus stop. The world continued moving while I held the steering wheel so tightly my fingers hurt. At the emergency department, a staff member confirmed my name and eventually brought me through secured doors. I expected to find Valerie sitting beside Iris. Instead, my sister was in a hallway, speaking with a hospital social worker. Damon stood several yards away near the wall. He was calm. That was what I remember first. Not frantic, not shouting, not pacing. Calm. He stood with one wrist held behind his back, the way he often did when he wanted to appear reasonable. His shirt was wrinkled at one shoulder, but his voice carried evenly when he answered questions. Every other person in that hallway looked as though something terrible had happened. Damon looked as though everyone else had become unnecessarily emotional about an unfortunate misunderstanding. That afternoon, I only knew that seeing him made my stomach tighten. Someone explained that the hospital had concerns about Iris's injuries and about information beginning to emerge around what had happened at home. Mandatory reporting had already begun. Child protection staff had been contacted. Law enforcement was gathering information. Nobody gave me a complete history in the hallway, and they should not have. Iris's medical information was not a family newsletter, and an investigation was not something relatives were entitled to supervise simply because we were frightened. What mattered was that I could see her. When I entered Iris's room, the first thing I noticed was how little space she seemed to occupy beneath the blanket. At 11, she had always been a narrow, quick-moving child. She was the kind of girl who forgot she had left a glass of water in one room because she had already chased another thought into the next. At family gatherings, she used to sit sideways in chairs until somebody told her to put both feet on the floor. She drew tiny faces in the margins of notebooks and hated raisins with a seriousness I found ridiculous. The child in the hospital bed barely moved. Her physical condition had been stabilized, but there were visible signs that her body had been through something serious. I did not need details. I could see enough in the careful way staff approached her and in the way she guarded parts of herself whenever somebody came too close. I said her name, Iris. Her eyes found me immediately. Her lips parted. Nothing came out. I waited because I assumed her throat hurt. She tried again. That was when I saw panic move across her face. Not dramatic panic. No screaming. No thrashing. Her mouth formed the beginning of something, and then stopped. One hand tightened around the edge of the blanket. I moved closer without thinking and asked whether she could tell me what she needed. Her shoulders rose. A nurse beside me gently redirected the moment. Iris had been awake, and apparently understanding simple communication, but she had not been producing speech. The team was still evaluating her. Nothing obvious in the first examinations suggested a structural injury to her throat, or vocal mechanisms severe enough to explain why she could not speak at all. They were not making promises or attaching a permanent diagnosis to the silence. They had simply stopped treating spoken words as the only acceptable response. A small writing pad rested beside the bed. The nurse showed me that Iris could nod, shake her head, point, gesture, or write when she felt able. I was frightened, and frightened adults often confuse visible improvement with safety. I wanted Iris to say my name, because hearing her would have reassured me. I wanted her to tell me what happened, because information felt like something I could use. I wanted one familiar part of her back immediately. None of those wants belonged to Iris. So I sat down. I kept my hands in my lap and asked whether she wanted me there. After several seconds, she nodded. That tiny movement was the first decision she made in front of me that afternoon. Footsteps passed the doorway. Her gaze snapped toward the sound. A cart rattled somewhere down the corridor. Iris flinched. Every time a male voice came from outside the room, some part of her body seemed to prepare before her mind had time to understand whether the voice belonged to Damon. Damon had told people Iris was anxious. He was not entirely wrong about the symptom. He was wrong about what the symptom meant. When I stepped back into the hallway, I heard enough of his explanation to understand what he was trying to do. He described a difficult child, an escalating situation, a frightened family. He suggested Iris could become confused when overwhelmed. He did not accuse her of lying outright. He was smarter than that. He placed little pieces of doubt around her and allowed other people to decide whether to pick them up. I found Valerie sitting alone for a moment, near the end of the corridor. Her purse was clutched between both hands. She had been crying, though she had cleaned her face enough that only a faint darkness beneath her eyes remained. For a few seconds, looking at her brought back a version of Valerie that had existed before Damon. The sister who once phoned me because she had locked herself out with groceries melting in the hallway. The woman who could make Iris laugh by deliberately singing songs with the wrong words. The person who had held her newborn daughter in our mother's living room and looked terrified by how much she loved her. I wanted that woman to still be there. I asked what had happened. Valerie answered in fragments. Things had been bad for a long time. Damon could become frightening. She had spent years trying not to provoke him. Iris had become more nervous as she grew older. There had been incidents she had tried to smooth over. I listened. Some of what she said sounded like fear, because it was fear. I knew enough even then to understand that people can become trapped inside controlling relationships and make choices from places other people cannot easily see. But as Valerie spoke, something began bothering me. She kept describing why she had stayed with Damon. She never described how she planned to leave with Iris. That distinction did not fully register until we returned near the room. Damon was no longer allowed close to Iris without staff controlling access, but at one point he appeared within view of the doorway while people were sorting out the next steps. Iris saw him. The change was immediate. Her fingers pressed flat against the blanket. Her breathing shortened. Her eyes fixed on him. Damon stayed calm. He told the people around him that all the questioning was overwhelming her. Valerie entered the room before I could. She moved toward the bed and used the childhood nickname only she ever called Iris. Riss. Iris turned toward her mother. For one fragile second, hope changed her face. Whatever Iris feared about Damon, whatever she had endured before reaching that hospital, she still believed her mother approaching the bed meant something had become safer. Valerie stood there looking down at her. Then she looked toward the hallway where Damon was waiting. I watched her shoulders change. The mother disappeared behind something harder. She asked to speak with me outside. I followed because I did not want Iris hearing adults argue over her. Valerie began listing everything she believed would come next. Doctors, therapy, school accommodations, interviews, appointments, questions from authorities, months of disruption, maybe years. The way she spoke made Iris's recovery sound like a sentence Valerie had just been given. I reminded her Iris was 11. Valerie rubbed both hands over her face. She said I did not understand what living with Damon had cost her. She said she had spent years terrified of saying the wrong thing or pushing him too far. Sometimes agreeing with him had been the only way she knew to keep things from becoming worse. But being harmed does not make every choice afterward harmless. I asked her what she was going to do now. She looked through the narrow window in Iris's door. The room lights had been lowered slightly. Her daughter was awake, watching us without being able to hear every word through the glass. Valerie stared at her for several seconds. I won't waste my life raising a broken child. The sentence was quiet enough that I wondered for one stupid second whether I had heard it correctly. Then I saw that Valerie was already gathering herself, as if something had been decided. But Iris was only a few feet away. I would not turn her hospital room into another place where angry adults fought because of her. So I kept my voice low. I told Valerie her daughter had just survived something serious. I told her Iris was lying behind that door, expecting her mother to be the person who stayed. Then Damon appeared. The investigation had begun, but beginning an investigation is not the same thing as making an immediate arrest. Medical documentation was still being reviewed. Accounts were being taken. Authorities were working through the evidence and the legal steps available to them. Damon had restrictions around Iris inside the hospital, but nobody had yet placed him in handcuffs. He collected what he had brought with him. Valerie stood. I remember staring at her purse when she lifted it from the chair. For some reason, seeing her pick it up made the decision real. I thought she would walk Damon to the elevator and then return. I thought she would need air. I thought there was some invisible boundary in motherhood that panic could push a person toward but not across. She followed him into the elevator. Damon entered first. Valerie stepped in beside him. The doors began closing. She did not turn around. When I returned to Iris's room, she was looking directly at the doorway. She had seen enough. I sat beside the bed. For a long time, neither of us tried to communicate. The sun dropped behind the buildings outside, turning the hospital window into a dark mirror. Nurses came and went. A doctor checked on Iris. Someone brought me coffee I forgot to drink. A social worker explained that the next several days would involve safety planning and that child protection professionals would need to determine where Iris could go once she was medically ready for discharge. The words temporary kinship placement were mentioned. I barely understood them then. My house was 15 or 20 minutes from work depending on traffic. I had a spare bedroom. I had stable employment. I was Iris's aunt. Those facts suddenly mattered in ways they never had before. But none of that mattered to Iris yet. She was still listening for footsteps. At one point I reached toward her hand. She pulled it beneath the blanket. I stopped immediately. An hour later, I asked whether she wanted me to move my chair farther away. She shook her head. So I stayed where I was, close, but not touching. After dark, Iris moved one hand toward the writing pad. I placed it within easier reach. She held the pen awkwardly. Her fingers shook enough that the first mark streaked sideways across the paper. She stopped, tried again. I watched letters appear slowly. If I can't talk, will you still want me? I have never forgotten those 9 words. An 11-year-old girl had watched her mother look at what had happened to her and decide she had become too difficult to keep. Iris was asking whether there was something else she could lose that would make me reach the same conclusion. I did not tell her everything would be fine. I did not tell her Valerie would come back once she calmed down. I did not promise her voice would return. Those were promises I could not control. Instead, I placed my hand palm up on the mattress, leaving enough distance that Iris could choose whether to touch it. Yes. For several seconds, she only looked at my hand. Then her fingers slid across the blanket and closed around 2 of mine. It was the beginning of my understanding that my answer could not be something I gave her only while the hospital lights were on. The days that followed filled themselves with practical realities. I took leave from work. The hospital continued physical evaluations. Staff adjusted how they communicated with Iris, rather than turning every interaction into another test of whether she could speak. There was still no obvious structural injury explaining a complete loss of speech. The medical team made no promises about how quickly anything might change. Child protection staff interviewed me about my home, employment, relationship with Iris, and whether I would accept temporary kinship placement when she was ready to leave the hospital. I said yes again. While I filled out forms, authorities preserved medical information and gathered what they needed from the people involved. The concerns surrounding Damon were no longer being treated as a family argument. There was a serious investigation. At first, I assumed they would find Damon quickly. He had ordinary traces: a home, a phone, a work history, and I could not imagine someone simply disappearing because questions had become uncomfortable. Except Damon had not gone home. Neither had Valerie. I called my sister repeatedly during those first 2 days. The calls stopped connecting normally. Messages went unanswered. Once, Iris saw her mother's name on my phone screen while I was trying again. Her eyes stayed on the phone until the screen went dark. On the second evening, someone connected to the case spoke with me privately. Attempts to locate Damon had expanded beyond the places he would normally be expected to go. Investigators had not found him at home. Valerie had not returned either. Their recent movements were being checked while the abuse case continued through the process required for more serious action. I asked whether Valerie might be in danger. There was no answer anyone could responsibly give me yet. The last confirmed information they had was brutally simple. She had left the hospital voluntarily with Damon. They had gone together. I returned to Iris's room after that conversation. She was sleeping lightly, one hand resting beside the writing pad. The page containing her question was still near the top. The phone remained silent. My sister and the man Iris feared had not simply walked out of the building. They had disappeared together. For the first few days after Valerie and Damon disappeared, I kept expecting the situation to correct itself in some ordinary way. A detective would call and say, Damon had been found. Valerie would appear at the hospital alone, exhausted and ashamed, and ask whether she could sit beside her daughter. My phone would light up with my sister's name, and I would discover there was still some explanation I had failed to imagine. None of those things happened. Instead, Iris improved enough physically for doctors to begin talking seriously about discharge, and every conversation about where she would go ended with people looking toward me. I had said yes when temporary kinship care was first mentioned. The word temporary had allowed me to answer a question about one frightened child without answering a question about the rest of my life. By the time I drove Iris away from the hospital, I had learned that temporary could contain a surprising amount of paperwork. She sat in the passenger seat with the writing notebook on her lap and watched the side mirror more often than the road ahead. I noticed it before we had gone 5 blocks. Every time a dark vehicle stayed behind us through more than one turn, her shoulders tightened. At a red light, she twisted far enough to look through the rear window. I told her quietly that nobody from the hospital had followed us, and that my address had been given only to the people who needed it for her placement and care. She nodded, but a minute later she checked the mirror again. I almost told her she was safe. The sentence rose automatically because adults use it when we desperately want something to become true. I stopped myself. Damon had not been found. Valerie had not been found. There were precautions in place, but I could not guarantee that danger had evaporated because I had locked my car doors. My house was a modest one-story place in a Denver neighborhood built before anyone decided every new home needed a grand entrance. I had always liked that it was uncomplicated. 2 bedrooms, a narrow office, a kitchen that opened into the living room, and a backyard just large enough for a table, 4 chairs, and the herbs I repeatedly forgot to water. That afternoon, I saw every window and doorway differently because Iris did. She stood inside the entrance for nearly a minute, without taking off her shoes. Her eyes moved from the front windows to the hallway, then toward the sliding door at the back. I showed her the spare bedroom, and told her she could move anything she disliked. She touched the doorknob, opened the door fully, then closed it halfway. A few seconds later, she opened it again. That first night I learned she could not sleep with the bedroom door closed. Fully open was not right either. She moved it until there was a gap wide enough to see the hallway and narrow enough that the room did not feel exposed. I left the hall light on. At 2 a.m, I woke to a faint click and found her checking the front lock. She looked embarrassed when she saw me. I did not ask why she was awake. I checked the lock once with her, then went back to bed, without making her watch me check every window. I was beginning to understand that reassurance could become a ritual of fear if I performed enough of it. The second night, she hid 2 granola bars beneath her pillow. I discovered them only because I was changing the case after she spilled water. Iris immediately reached for the notebook. Her pencil moved quickly enough that the letters became narrow and crowded. She wrote that she was sorry, and that she would not take food without asking again. I stared at the 2 crushed wrappers in her hand, and realized she thought the problem was theft. I told her she did not need permission to eat food in my house. The next morning, I put a basket of snacks on a low kitchen shelf, and told her they were hers whenever she wanted them. She still hid 1 apple in the bedroom that week. I found it days later behind a stack of books. I did not mention it. The basket stayed full. Her fear did not repeat itself in exactly the same shape. Sometimes it was the door, sometimes food, sometimes the sound of a truck slowing outside. A cabinet slammed when I dropped a cutting board, and Iris ducked before either of us seemed to understand why. Once the heating system clicked on while she was brushing her teeth, and she came into the living room gripping the toothbrush, so tightly toothpaste had squeezed between her fingers. I started warning her before using the blender or vacuum cleaner. Then I caught myself announcing every ordinary noise in the house, as if we lived beside an unexploded bomb. That could not become our life either. There was a difference between giving her predictability and teaching her that every sound required preparation. I did not know where that line was yet. The notebook became the one thing neither of us misplaced. At first, it stayed within Iris's reach from morning until night. She wrote practical things: water, headache, lights off, bathroom. Then came questions. She wanted to know whether the hospital knew where Damon was, whether police knew, whether Valerie was with him, whether Damon knew my address. The same question appeared in slightly different forms, until one evening she stopped trying to soften it and wrote, "Can he find me?" I read the sentence while she watched my face. There was an answer that would have made the room easier for both of us. No. I could have written it in large letters and watched her shoulders relax for 10 minutes. Instead, I told her what I actually knew. Adults responsible for the case were looking for Damon. People involved with her care were taking precautions. School would not receive information casually. My address was not being handed around. If anyone suspicious appeared, we had people to call and procedures to follow. But I could not promise Damon was incapable of finding us. Iris looked down. My chest hurt at the disappointment in her face. Then she wrote, "Okay." Her recovery quickly became larger than any single doctor or appointment. The hospital follow-ups dealt with her physical healing and made sure nothing had been missed. A speech and communication specialist evaluated what Iris could comfortably do without treating spoken language like an exam she had failed. School staff began discussing how she might return when she was ready and how she could communicate in class. Trauma treatment moved more slowly because even the word treatment made Iris watch the door. There were people whose job was to understand her body, people whose job was to support communication, people whose job was to plan education, and people whose job was to help her mind stop expecting danger every minute. That was how Dr. Elias Monroe entered our lives. Elias was 38, a clinical psychologist consulting with the trauma team. The first time I saw him with Iris, he did almost nothing that looked impressive. He did not pull his chair close to the bed or table. He did not lean forward with the concerned expression adults use when we want children to reward our concern. He sat far enough away that Iris could leave the space between them untouched. On the table were a notebook, a few cards, and simple ways to indicate yes, no, stop, more time, or no answer. Iris studied him longer than she studied the materials. He allowed her to. There were pauses so long that I wanted to fill them. I had spent my working life fixing delays. Silence felt like a meeting going wrong. I caught myself explaining things Iris could have communicated herself. Elias never embarrassed me for it. He would simply redirect his attention toward her and wait again. At one appointment, another part of the care team discussed whether Iris might be willing to attempt a sound or a word during structured communication work. Nobody was cruel or forceful, but I felt my entire body lean toward the possibility. I wanted progress I could hear. Iris saw that. Her hand moved away from the cards. Elias noticed before I did. He shifted the conversation away from performance and back toward what made communication feel safe. Later, when Iris and I were alone in the car, she wrote only one sentence about the appointment. "You wanted me to do it." My job changed shape around Iris's life, without formally changing at all. I was still employed. My salary still arrived. My mortgage was paid. Groceries appeared in the refrigerator, and the electricity stayed on. There was no dramatic financial collapse. The cost showed itself differently. I used leave for appointments. I stopped volunteering for projects that required late meetings. I arranged my workday around transportation, case calls, school planning, and the possibility that Iris might need me unexpectedly. My supervisor was reasonable, but reasonable did not make hours expand. Work I once finished before going home sometimes waited until morning. Invitations from colleagues began receiving the same answer. I probably couldn't. There were forms everywhere. Kinship placement forms, medical authorizations, school documents, insurance information, emergency contacts, lists of people permitted to pick Iris up, and people absolutely not permitted to receive information about her. I bought a large accordion folder because my kitchen counter disappeared beneath paper. Within 2 weeks, the folder was too small. Iris noticed every adjustment. That bothered me more than the paperwork. If I left work early, she watched the clock when I came through the door. If I carried groceries inside while answering a call about her care, she took bags from my hands without being asked. One evening, I found her washing a plate immediately after dinner, even though there were 3 other dishes in the sink. She dried it, put it away, wiped the counter, then stood there looking for another job. She was trying not to cost me anything. Time. Work, food, effort, space. One afternoon I was 10 minutes late getting home. Not an hour. Not even half an hour. Traffic had backed up after a minor accident, and my phone had been buried in my bag on the passenger floor where I could not reach it safely. When I pulled into the driveway, Iris was standing inside the front window. The moment she saw my car, she disappeared. I found her in the hallway with the notebook open against the wall. She had written my name twice and then crossed it out. Her breathing was too fast. She looked furious, which surprised me until I realized fear had arrived first, and anger had been easier to hold. I apologized for being late. Instead, I told her I would do better about letting her know when plans changed. But sometimes cars broke down, meetings ran long, and people came home later than expected. Late did not mean gone. She stared at me. Then she wrote, "Mom said she was coming back." I had no answer that could repair what those words had done to the word late. So I sat on the floor several feet away until her breathing slowed. That week, Elias had a session with Iris that changed the way I understood what we were doing. He brought nothing clever, no special exercise, no promise about speech. He offered her several ways to answer and asked, in simple language, what she wanted the adults around her to stop doing. Instead, she bent over the notebook for almost a minute. Then she turned it around. "Stop asking why I didn't tell sooner." The question had existed in my mind the first days in the hospital, not as blame, I told myself, but confusion. How had I missed this? How had teachers missed it? How had Valerie allowed it? Why had Iris not called me? Why had she never written something before the night she asked whether I still wanted her? He said the responsibility for noticing and protecting had belonged to adults, not to her. I stopped asking after that, not only aloud, in my own head. The practical world continued moving, while Iris and I learned these smaller things. The child welfare process did not end because she had been discharged safely to a relative. Her parents were still missing. Attempts to locate and contact them continued. The people handling her placement explained that temporary arrangements needed clearer structure if days became weeks. I participated in meetings where nobody delivered a dramatic announcement. Instead, professionals discussed school consent, medical authority, placement review, notice requirements, safety restrictions, and what would happen if either parent suddenly appeared. School planning made that reality visible. Before she could return, staff needed to know how communication would work, what information could be shared, who was authorized to contact her, and what to do if someone claiming to be family appeared. Damon's name and Valerie's name could not simply sit on ordinary pickup forms, as though this were a normal disagreement between adults. Procedures were put in place. Iris would have ways to communicate without being forced to speak. Certain staff members would know the safety plan. Not every teacher needed the details of her trauma. I sat through those conversations taking notes as if preparing for a work project. One evening I spread everything across the kitchen table after Iris went to her room. My calendar held medical follow-ups, communication support, trauma appointments, school meetings, agency calls, and work obligations. I moved one meeting at the library, then another. I crossed out a professional conference I had been considering for the fall. And still, whenever I felt the weight of it, I remembered Valerie in the hospital, saying she would not waste her life raising a broken child. I became ashamed of my own exhaustion. That was another mistake. Love did not mean never feeling tired. Staying did not require me to pretend nothing cost anything. If I turned caregiving into sainthood, Iris would eventually believe every difficult day was evidence that she was hurting me. Iris slowly stopped hiding food. The bedroom door remained partly open. She still checked the front lock, but not every night. The notebook filled faster than I expected. Some pages contained medical questions. Some contained complaints about food. One afternoon, she wrote that the soup I had bought tasted like warm water pretending to be dinner. I stared at the sentence until I realized something unfamiliar had entered our house. I bought a different kind the next week. The people responsible for the case had not located either parent, and I never lied about that. I told Iris decisions about her safety would not be made by someone simply arriving at my door and demanding her. There were adults, processes, and restrictions in place. She listened, but I could see she was still trying to understand whether adults meant what they said once another adult became angry enough. Weeks after discharge, one of the placement meetings ended with a phrase that followed me home. Longer-term planning. The professionals explained that because neither parent had been located and Iris's needs continued, my role could no longer be treated as an emergency favor that would naturally expire. Additional family court and child welfare steps would be necessary. Authority for school and care needed stability. Search and notice efforts would continue. Nothing was being magically resolved. The temporary arrangement was simply being asked to survive reality. By then, preserved medical and child protection evidence had supported an arrest warrant for Damon, but authorities still had not located him. I drove home with the accordion folder on the passenger seat. It was thicker than it had been the week before. That evening, Iris was at the kitchen table. We had started using a clean notebook for ordinary household communication because the hospital pad had become something neither of us wanted to throw away. On one page, I had written home at the top and listed simple things beneath it. My address, my phone number, the school contact, where emergency numbers were kept. I meant it as practical information. Iris stared at the word for a long time. Then she picked up her pencil. She wrote beneath it slowly, "How long can I stay?" Iris's question stayed open on the kitchen table between us. She had written it beneath the word home, as if the two things might cancel each other out. Home was supposed to mean permanence. Stay implied permission that could expire. I did not tell her forever. At that point, I did not yet have the legal authority to promise forever, and I had learned enough about promises to understand that wanting one to be true did not make it mine to give. I told her what I could stand behind. She was staying with me now. Nobody was taking her anywhere that night or the next morning. The adults handling her case were working on something more stable, and I would tell her the truth when I knew more. She read my answer, then looked toward the hallway as if checking whether the house itself had heard it. That autumn, the word temporary began lasting long enough to require routines. Iris returned to school gradually. The first morning, I drove her there nearly 40 minutes early because I had spent the night imagining every possible thing that could go wrong and had decided traffic should not be one of them. The school had already put a communication plan in place. Iris carried laminated cards in a small pouch she chose herself. Yes. No. Stop. Wait. I need a break. She also carried a notebook, though by then, she had become fast enough with gestures that writing every sentence was no longer necessary. The adults had been told not to turn communication into a performance. That did not mean they always knew what to do. People are uncomfortable with silence, especially when they believe their job is to help. Teachers would ask Iris a question, wait 3 seconds, then look at me. Counselors would explain something directly to her, and then glance at my face for confirmation. At first, I answered automatically. I was trying to keep things smooth. Iris began correcting that. One morning, a teacher asked whether she wanted to stay in the classroom during a group presentation or work from a quieter space. Iris hesitated. The teacher looked toward me. I had already opened my mouth when Iris lifted one finger without looking at me. Wait. I closed it. She thought for another 10 seconds, then pointed toward the classroom. It was such a small thing that nobody else would have remembered it by lunch. I remembered it for years. For months. Iris had lived in a world where adults made decisions around her because silence looked like absence. That morning, she taught 3 adults that waiting was also an action. I should have learned faster. Instead, as Iris became more capable of choosing, I became more determined to remove anything she might have to choose around. Fear had settled into me differently than it had settled into her. Iris checked doors. I checked possibilities. If there was an optional school activity that ended after dark, I found a reason she should skip it. If a route home passed near the neighborhood where she had once lived, I drove an extra 15 minutes around it. If a classmate's parent offered to bring her home after a project, I said I would handle transportation. I rearranged my work schedule so aggressively that there were weeks when I seemed to be measuring success by how rarely Iris was out of my sight. Nobody had seen Damon. That did not reassure me. His absence had become a shape I could place anywhere. A dark sedan at the curb, a man standing too long near a school entrance, an unfamiliar number on my phone. I did not tell Iris every fear that crossed my mind. But children do not need a transcript to understand the rules adults build around danger. She began noticing what I canceled. One Friday, the school offered a small after-hours art event. Iris wanted to go. She had begun sketching again, though her drawings had changed from the tiny faces I remembered before the hospital to rooms, windows, doorways, hands. The event would be supervised. Parents could attend. There was no practical reason we could not go. I said we should skip it because she had an appointment the next morning. She stared at me long enough that I knew she did not believe me. Then she pulled out her notebook. "You said school is safe." I told her it was. She wrote beneath it. "Then why can't I stay there?" That did not mean every restriction was loving. At the next appointment where Elias was involved, I mentioned the conflict because I expected him to help me explain why caution mattered. Instead, he asked me what I thought Iris was learning each time fear made the decision before she could. I defended myself more than I am proud of. Damon was still missing. Iris had been through something terrible. One mistake could matter. Elias did not disagree with any of that. He separated safety planning from total control. Necessary precautions could exist without making every optional choice for her. A child who had spent years learning that the most powerful adult decided everything did not need a new version of the same lesson, simply because the new adult loved her. I went home and looked at the list taped beside my refrigerator. School numbers, case contacts, appointment times, backup transportation, rules for who could receive information, emergency procedures. None of those were the problem. The problem was that I had started treating every unknown as if it were an emergency. Iris went to the next art event. I stayed. I sat near the back of the room with a paperback I did not read, but I did not stand beside her table or watch the door every 30 seconds. At one point, Iris looked over at me, saw I was still there, and returned to her drawing. Nothing happened. That ordinary nothing felt like progress. By then I had stopped believing there would be one dramatic morning when Iris woke up and began talking exactly as before. She could communicate too much for me to keep measuring her by sound alone. She told me what food she hated, when a room was too crowded, whether she wanted company, whether she disagreed with me. Some days she wrote pages. Some days she used only cards. Sometimes her hands moved before the rest of her body caught up, a gesture sharp enough to carry irritation without a single word. The first sound of joy came because of a stupid accident. Elias was working with Iris in one of the low-pressure communication sessions, where the point was not to produce speech, but to make choice feel ordinary. Several laminated cards were spread across the floor near his chair. Iris had become comfortable enough with him by then that she sometimes looked bored, which I had learned to consider an achievement. At some point, Elias stood to reach for a folder. He took 2 steps. Iris's eyes dropped toward his shoe. Something changed in her face. A laminated card had stuck to the bottom of it. No. He walked another step without noticing. Iris pressed her lips together. I saw her shoulders move once. Then again, a sound escaped before she could stop it. Small, breathy, but unmistakably laughter. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Elias looked down at his shoe, saw the card, and peeled it off. For half a heartbeat, I thought he might say something about what had just happened. He did not. He placed the card back with the others and continued what he had been doing. I wanted to cry. I wanted to laugh with her. I wanted to grab the moment and hold it up like proof that everything was going to be all right. Instead, I dug my fingernails lightly into my palm and stayed quiet. Iris looked at me. She knew I had heard. I smiled. Nothing more. That night I cried in the bathroom with the faucet running. I cried because for 1 second, sound had come out of Iris without fear standing behind it. After that, Weeks passed. The laugh did not unlock conversation. She did not suddenly begin saying words, because everyone had witnessed evidence that her voice could physically emerge. There were still mornings when a simple appointment left her exhausted. There were still moments when too many questions made her retreat into short gestures and a closed notebook. Then one afternoon, the first word arrived almost as quietly as the laugh had. Elias was using a simple grounding activity. Nothing dramatic. A few objects were placed within Iris's reach, and he was letting her decide what entered her space and what did not. By then, he had built the habit of asking permission before moving anything closer to her. He indicated one object and asked whether he could place it nearer. Iris's hand went toward the pouch where her cards were kept. She touched the edge of it, stopped. Her throat moved. I watched her mouth form a shape I had seen hundreds of times in the months since the hospital, always without sound. No. The word was barely louder than breath. I stopped breathing anyway. Elias did not smile broadly. He did not praise her. He did not ask her to say it again. Okay. He moved the object away. That was all. Iris stared at him. Then she looked at me. It was no. The smallest word in the room returned something Damon had spent years taking from her: the right to refuse. For the rest of that day, Iris did not speak again. On the drive home, I did not ask whether she could. We stopped for groceries. She pointed at the cereal she wanted, shook her head at the soup she still considered an insult, and wrote one reminder on the list when I forgot laundry detergent. Nothing about the afternoon looked miraculous. That made it more beautiful. As winter gave way to 2017, our lives accumulated more ordinary days. Iris turned 12 in February. We did not throw a large party. She chose a chocolate cake, 2 school friends, and a movie at home. She blew out the candles without making a sound, and nobody asked her to wish for her voice. The legal process continued quietly in the background. Authorities had still not located Damon or Valerie. Required efforts to contact and notify them continued. There were reviews, filings, records from the hospital and school, and more meetings than I could later count. My role gradually shifted from the person authorized to handle an emergency placement toward the adult, given longer-term responsibility. There was no dramatic courtroom victory. No judge slammed a gavel and declared that love had won. I sat in ordinary rooms with professionals who had stacks of other families waiting after ours. Questions were asked about Iris's care, schooling, medical follow-up, finances, safety, and wishes. People checked whether my home remained appropriate. Documents changed what I was allowed to sign and what decisions I could make on her behalf. Eventually, I received longer-term guardianship authority. The paper mattered enormously to me. To Iris, one line mattered more. My address stayed the same. When I explained that the arrangement was more stable now, she looked around the kitchen as though expecting the walls to change color. Then she wrote, "So this is still where I live?" I said yes. She nodded and went back to eating. I had spent months learning that the largest moments in my life often arrived, disguised as ordinary questions. Iris's speech remained uneven. A few words began appearing under low pressure, then disappeared again when she was tired or frightened. Sometimes she tried one sound and became frustrated with herself when another would not follow. The treatment team kept the same message. Communication first, safety first, choice first. Speech could not become the rent she paid for everyone's optimism. By the second half of 2017, the absence of Valerie had become less dramatic and more difficult. In the beginning, every unanswered call felt like an emergency. After more than a year, silence had become a pattern. I still occasionally searched for harmless explanations. Fear, shame, Damon's control. Maybe Valerie was somewhere trying to leave him. Maybe she believed returning would put Iris in danger. I did not tell Iris those stories anymore, but I sometimes told them to myself. Then a piece of official information arrived that seemed, at first, to support the version I wanted to believe. Valerie had obtained a divorce from Damon in another state. I read the information several times before I trusted myself to understand it. The process had not happened overnight. Time had passed. Residency and filing requirements had been handled. Damon had not appeared publicly beside her in some dramatic hearing. The legal marriage between them was over. I sat alone at my kitchen table with the information in front of me and felt something I had not allowed myself to feel in months. Hope. Maybe Valerie had finally escaped him. Maybe leaving the hospital with Damon had not been the last choice she made. Maybe the woman I remembered from before him had eventually surfaced somewhere far away, frightened and ashamed, and trying to rebuild enough strength to come home. The thought was dangerous because it felt compassionate. I held on to it for several days before telling Iris. When I finally did, she was sitting at the same kitchen table where she had once written, "How long can I stay?" She was 12 now, older in ways birthdays could not measure. I explained only what I actually knew. Valerie and Damon were legally divorced. I did not say that meant Valerie was coming back. I did not tell Iris she should forgive her mother. I did not even tell her I thought the divorce was good news. I simply gave her the fact. Iris read the short summary I had written for her. Her face did not brighten. She picked up her pencil. For a moment I thought she might ask where Valerie lived now. Instead, she wrote one sentence. "Then why didn't she come back?" I had no answer for the question Iris left on the kitchen table. For a long time, I had treated Valerie's absence as if it were a problem waiting for one missing fact. If Damon was controlling her, perhaps fear explained it. If she had no money, perhaps dependence explained it. If she was ashamed, perhaps shame explained it. The divorce removed one of those explanations, and instead of making the past easier to understand, it made the empty space around my sister harder to excuse. I did not tell Iris that. I did not know. For once, she did not write anything underneath. By then, Iris's voice had begun appearing in pieces. A word at breakfast, 2 words in the car, a sentence, 1 week followed by a day when she communicated only with her notebook. Progress did not move like a staircase. It was closer to weather. Some mornings opened clear and stayed that way. Others changed without warning. The first setback large enough to frighten both of us happened at school. Iris was 12, nearing 13, and had reached the point where she could manage much of the school day without me hovering in the background. She still had a communication plan, and still carried cards, but there were classes where she used spoken words when she felt able. Her teachers had learned not to celebrate every sentence as though someone had rung a bell. Then one afternoon, a male teacher raised his voice. He was not yelling at Iris. Another student had been disrupting class, and the teacher lost patience. According to the school staff who later explained what happened, his voice cracked across the room sharply enough that everyone went quiet. Iris did too. For the rest of the day, she could not speak. When I arrived, she was sitting in a small counseling office, with both hands locked around the straps of her backpack. Her eyes met mine, then dropped immediately. I knew that look. Not fear of the teacher. Shame. She had come far enough that losing speech now felt to her like losing evidence that she had improved. In the car, she did not reach for the notebook until we were almost home. I thought I was better. 4 words. No accusation. No drama. They hurt anyway. A year earlier, I might have tried to reassure her by listing all the things she could do now that she had not been able to do after the hospital. I might have told her this was only one bad day, that tomorrow would be different, that she was still improving. Instead, I asked whether she wanted me to say anything at all. She shook her head, so we drove the rest of the way home in silence. That evening, she used gestures. The next morning, she wrote. Later that day, a few words came back. Nobody announced that the crisis was over. The care team had warned us that extreme stress could temporarily disrupt speech again. Hearing the explanation before it happened had not prepared either of us for seeing it. Iris had quietly developed the belief that recovery meant moving farther from the girl she had been in the hospital. When her body reacted the old way, she assumed she had been dragged all the way back. I had developed a habit I was embarrassed to admit. I counted words, not aloud. Never where Iris could hear me, or so I told myself. 3 sentences at breakfast, nothing in the car, 2 answers during an appointment, a joke at dinner. On difficult days, the numbers went down, and my anxiety went up. The more frightened I became, the more attention I paid to speech, and the more attention I paid to speech, the more Iris could feel herself being measured. After the school incident, I stopped. Not perfectly. Habits built from fear do not disappear because a person decides they are unhealthy. But I changed what I watched. Had Iris asked for a break before becoming overwhelmed? Had she told a teacher she disagreed? Had she returned to class after leaving? Had she chosen to go somewhere, even though it made her nervous? Had she corrected me when I made an assumption? Those things began mattering more than how many sounds came out of her mouth. One afternoon she came home from school, dropped her backpack beside the kitchen chair, and pointed at the calendar. There was a class event scheduled for Friday evening. A year earlier, I would have looked immediately for reasons not to go. Instead, I asked whether she wanted to attend. She nodded. That was the whole conversation. I did not count the absence of speech. I counted the choice. By late 2017, Elias's consulting work with Iris was ending. I had known for weeks that the transition was coming. His role had always been limited. He was one part of a larger team, not the center of her recovery. And the point of good clinical care was never to make one professional emotionally indispensable. Knowing that did not make the final appointment feel completely ordinary. Iris had come to trust him in the cautious way she trusted almost everyone then, by watching what he did repeatedly, rather than believing what he promised once. He had never asked her to prove progress for him. He had never treated her silence like failure. He had never used his knowledge of trauma as permission to decide what she meant. When it was time for his direct involvement to end, he did not turn the goodbye into a speech about how proud he was. He told Iris that the work ahead belonged to her life, not to him, and that she had never owed him a successful outcome. Iris gave him a folded piece of paper before we left. I did not read it. He did not show it to me. Whatever she had written belonged to the two of them. As we walked through the parking lot, Iris glanced back once toward the building. Then she kept walking. There was no romantic beginning hidden inside that goodbye. Elias moved out of the daily structure of our lives. Other professionals remained where their roles required them. School became more important. Friends became more important. Ordinary adolescence began pushing its way into a story that had spent too long revolving around survival. That was good. Iris deserved years that were not organized around what Damon had done. By 14, her room looked less like a place prepared for temporary kinship care and more like a territory I entered only with permission. There were books stacked beside the bed, sketches pinned crookedly above the desk, a sweatshirt permanently occupying the back of her chair, and enough hair ties scattered through the house that I began finding them in places no human hair had ever been styled. She still had difficult days. She also had opinions about my driving. The opinions were increasingly spoken. The first time she called me, Mom happened in the kitchen. I was standing with the refrigerator door open, trying to decide whether milk that had expired the day before was actually unusable or merely being overly cautious, when I heard her behind me. "Mom?" I answered before understanding what she had said. "Yeah?" I turned. Iris was holding a permission form from school. Neither of us moved. Her expression changed first. Not panic, not regret exactly. Awareness. She had said the word without preparing it. I could have made that moment enormous. I wanted to. I wanted to cross the kitchen, hold her, tell her what it meant to me, ask whether she meant it, promise again that I would stay. Instead, I looked at the paper in her hand. She wanted a signature, so I signed it. That night, after she went to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table and pressed both hands against my face until the feeling passed enough for me to breathe normally. The next morning, she called me Meredith. 2 days later, Mom again. Neither one became a ceremony. That was how the word became real. Not because we declared it, because it survived ordinary use. Around the same time, I decided I should become better at the simple signs Iris still used when speech felt tiring. I bought a guide and practiced at night. My confidence grew much faster than my accuracy. One Saturday, I tried to sign something at breakfast that I believed meant, "Do you want more?" Iris froze with a spoon halfway to her mouth. Then one eyebrow lifted. She reached for a sticky note. "You just asked if I want another goat." I stared at my hands. There was no goat anywhere in the kitchen. I tried again. She shook her head so slowly that I could see teenage judgment developing in real time. I wrote back that perhaps she should appreciate the effort. She added underneath, "Goat unavailable." For the rest of that week, whenever I used a sign correctly, Iris glanced around the room, as if checking whether livestock might appear. Humor had entered the house without asking permission. Iris had spent years watching adults for danger. Now sometimes she watched me because I was ridiculous. There is healing in being able to find another person harmlessly embarrassing. The years began moving differently after that. Birthdays stopped feeling like checkpoints. School years ended, and new ones started. Iris joined activities I once would have discouraged. She learned which teachers would wait for her, and which needed reminding. She had friends who knew she sometimes went quiet under stress, and did not react as though silence were an emergency. Valerie remained absent. At first I noticed every missing occasion. 13, 14, a school performance, a certificate Iris pretended not to care about, a birthday dinner where she chose cheesecake instead of cake because she had decided cake was childish. Each time, some small part of me wondered whether Valerie would contact us. She never did. For years I had softened that absence for Iris. Eventually I stopped. I did not replace those explanations with cruelty. I simply stopped inventing motives for a woman who was capable of providing her own, and chose not to. Iris stopped waiting too. I noticed it one birthday when the doorbell rang during dinner. At 12, she would have frozen. At 14, she looked toward the hallway. At 15, she continued eating until I stood to answer it. The package was from a bookstore. Nothing changed in her face. That was when I realized she no longer expected Valerie to appear whenever the outside world made noise. There was relief in that. There was grief, too. Children do not stop waiting because they stop wanting. Sometimes they stop because waiting has become more painful than accepting the empty space. By 2019, Iris was 14, moving toward 15, and the girl who had once asked how long she could stay had begun using my house, as though permanence no longer required permission. She left shoes where I could trip over them. She complained when I bought the wrong cereal. She had a favorite spot on the couch, and became offended if I sat there when she returned from school. Home had become ordinary enough to annoy her. I considered that one of my greatest successes. Valerie existed mostly as a question neither of us asked often. Then, one evening, she appeared on my computer screen. I was at the kitchen table reviewing a community services newsletter, connected to work, when a link led me to an article about a philanthropic event somewhere outside Colorado. The photograph loaded before I read the headline. I knew the face immediately. 3 years had changed Valerie's appearance, but not enough for me to mistake her. The woman in the photograph had darker hair than Valerie used to wear. Her clothes were expensive-looking, without being flashy. Her posture had changed. She stood among donors and organizers with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being photographed. The name beneath the picture was not Valerie Pierce, Vivienne Laurent. I read it twice. The article described her as an entrepreneur and supporter of several charitable causes. It mentioned that she had rebuilt her life after a controlling early marriage. The language was polished, careful, flattering. There was truth inside it. That made it worse. Valerie had been afraid of Damon. Valerie had lived through control, but the biography had shaped that truth into something clean. A woman escaped. A woman rebuilt. A woman became stronger. There was no daughter. I searched the article again, convinced I had missed a line. No Iris. No child. Nothing about the hospital. Nothing about leaving with the man she now described as the marriage she had survived. I did not immediately call Iris over. I sat with the page open and felt old instincts return. Protect her. Close the laptop. Pretend I never saw it. For years I had tried not to make Valerie's choices the center of Iris's life. I did not want one article dragging her backward. Then I remembered what I had learned about safety. Protecting Iris did not mean deciding which truths she was allowed to know. She came into the kitchen looking for a charger and noticed my face before she noticed the screen. I turned the laptop toward her. She read silently. Her expression barely moved. She scrolled once, then stopped at the photograph. That was when I noticed the man in the background. He was not the focus of the image. Only part of him was visible near the edge, slightly behind Valerie and two other guests. Older than the Damon I remembered, or at least the photograph made him look that way. His face was turned partly aside. One arm rested behind his back. His other hand held one wrist. A familiar posture. My stomach tightened before my mind caught up. For a second, I saw Damon in the hospital hallway again. I leaned closer to the screen. The image blurred when enlarged. It could have been anyone. Men stood that way. 3 years had passed since the hospital, and I had spent those years seeing Damon in strangers whenever fear needed a face. I had learned not to turn every resemblance into evidence. I told myself that was what this was. I did not mention it to Iris. She was still reading Valerie's biography. At last she reached the line about rebuilding a life after a difficult marriage. Her eyes moved back toward the photograph, then toward the name. Vivienne Laurent. She sat down slowly. For years, Valerie's disappearance had allowed us to imagine emptiness. The woman on the screen was not lost. She was standing beneath professional lights at a charity event, smiling beside people who knew an edited version of her life. Iris read the biography one more time. Then she looked at me. Her voice was quiet but steady. She didn't disappear. She erased me. Iris said the sentence without raising her voice, then closed the article and went upstairs. For a long time after that, I sat alone at the kitchen table, looking at the black screen of my laptop. The woman calling herself Vivienne Laurent had taken the worst years of my niece's childhood and edited them until Valerie was the only survivor left in the story. Damon had become a controlling former husband she had overcome. Iris had become nothing at all. But the discovery did not send Iris running after her mother. For years I had assumed that if Valerie ever resurfaced, Iris would need answers immediately. I imagined letters drafted and redrafted, questions stored since childhood finally demanding somewhere to go. Instead, the older Iris became, the less interested she seemed in begging Valerie to acknowledge what she already knew. She had been abandoned. She had survived. Neither fact required her mother's signature. The years between that article and Iris's 18th birthday were not empty, but they became increasingly difficult to summarize through Valerie. School took up more space. Friends took up more space. Iris began volunteering with a communication support program that had been connected to some of the services she had received when she was younger. The organization was called the Open Door Communication Project. It worked with children and young people whose communication had been affected by trauma, neurological differences, anxiety, disability, or other barriers, and one principle mattered to Iris more than any brochure could have explained. Speech was not the price of being heard. She first returned as an older participant who could help younger kids understand the cards, notebooks, devices, and signals that had once made her own world larger. Nobody introduced her as an inspirational survivor. She hated that kind of thing. She preferred practical jobs, setting out materials, sitting beside someone who did not want to speak, showing a nervous teenager where the quiet room was, waiting without staring. Once I watched her sit across from a boy who refused to use the communication card in front of him because he believed needing it made him look stupid. Iris did not tell him about the hospital. She did not say she understood exactly how he felt. She slid the card closer, used one herself to answer the next question, then continued the activity as though nothing unusual had happened. 10 minutes later, the boy picked his up. In February 2023, she turned 18. The legal guardianship that had structured our lives for years came to its natural end because Iris was now an adult. I had expected the transition to feel larger. For so long, documents had defined what I could sign, where I could take her, who could make medical decisions, and what authority I had when schools or institutions asked who I was. Then one birthday arrived, and the law no longer required an answer. Iris was simply Iris, except she had one more legal choice she wanted to make. She changed her surname. Pierce had been the name she was born with. Damon's name, Valerie's married name, the name printed across years of documents connected to the house she had left in an ambulance. In fact, when Iris first mentioned it, I asked whether she was sure she was not doing it simply because seeing Pierce still hurt. She considered the question for several days. Then she told me she wanted Shaw. It's the name on the house I grew up in. That was all. I turned away under the excuse of looking for an envelope, because 18 years of adulthood had still not taught me how to cry gracefully in front of her. When the paperwork was complete, nothing changed at breakfast. She still left mugs beside the sink instead of putting them inside it. She still accused me of buying bananas at the exact stage of ripeness, designed to become unusable overnight. She still had the same laugh. But the first time an envelope arrived addressed to Iris Shaw, she left it unopened on the kitchen counter for half an hour. Every time she passed it, she looked down. Eventually, she picked it up and carried it to her room, long enough for home to become part of her name. By then, Open Door had become more than a program Iris once needed. She began taking on alumni responsibilities and mentoring younger participants. Some used speech, some did not. Some switched between methods depending on the day. Iris never presented one outcome as more successful than another. I noticed that whenever parents asked her how they could make their child talk more, Iris redirected them toward a different question. What made the child able to communicate more safely? Open Door occasionally published anonymous reflections from former participants, always with consent and with enough identifying detail removed that the young person's privacy remained intact. When staff asked Iris whether she would contribute something, she almost declined. Public survivor stories made her suspicious, especially after watching Valerie polish her own past into a philanthropic biography. Iris controlled what was used. Just a few lines about communication and choice. The sentence Open Door eventually published was the simplest one. My first word back was no. The anonymous reflection circulated modestly through Open Door's newsletters and donor materials. Nothing went viral. Nobody recognized Iris on the street. That suited her. A few parents wrote to the organization about how much the line had meant to them. Staff occasionally referenced it when explaining why consent and alternative communication mattered. Then life did something else I had not expected. It returned Elias Monroe to mine. More than 5 years had passed since his direct clinical involvement with Iris ended. There had been no private relationship during those years. No secret friendship. No emotional bridge kept waiting beneath professional boundaries. He had simply become one of the people from an important chapter who moved onward when his role ended. In 2023, I encountered him at an Open Door community event. He was there because his work had evolved toward consulting, program development, and trauma-informed communication initiatives. I was there because Iris had volunteered me for logistical help after learning that years of library operations had made me incapable of seeing a folding table without asking whether anyone had a floor plan. I recognized Elias across the room. He was older, obviously. So was I. His hair had begun graying at the temples. Mine had acquired enough silver that I had stopped blaming the bathroom lighting. For several minutes, neither of us did anything remarkable. We spoke about Open Door. He asked how Iris was doing, and I told him only things Iris would not mind me sharing. She was 18, she was volunteering, she had legally become Iris Shaw. He smiled at the last part but did not make it sentimental. That restraint was still familiar. I still resisted recognizing what was happening. Hyper-independence can become embarrassing when the emergency that created it ended years earlier. I had built a life around never needing another adult to stay. I knew how to manage work, bills, repairs, family logistics, medical systems, school systems, and every other practical problem that had entered my house since 2016. Relying on myself had once been survival. Eventually, it became personality. Elias did not challenge it directly. That would probably have made me run. He simply kept appearing where I had agreed he could appear. I told Iris we were not dating. Over the next 2 years, what I kept calling friendship became harder to misname. Iris was 20 by then, and standing at the kitchen counter cutting strawberries. She continued cutting them for several seconds before looking up. "Does he know that?" I stared at her. She dropped another strawberry into the bowl. That was the entire conversation. I accused her of becoming disrespectful in adulthood. She informed me that legal adulthood had made the situation irreversible. There had been a time when every joke in our house felt like evidence that Iris was healing. Now sometimes she was simply funny. That difference meant more to me than I could explain. The relationship with Elias remained slow because I needed it slow. He never tried to slide into the father-shaped space in Iris's life. When he came to the house, he did not inspect what needed fixing, or act like a man had finally arrived to manage things. Sometimes he helped with dinner. Sometimes I helped him with something. Sometimes Iris joined us, and sometimes she had plans elsewhere. She watched him differently than she had as a child. Now she watched consistency. Did the respectful man she remembered from a clinical room remain respectful when no professional rule required him to be? He did. That mattered to Iris. It mattered even more to me. While our own lives became increasingly ordinary, Vivienne Laurent became increasingly visible, recognizable within the kind of philanthropic and business circles where photographs mattered and introductions became currency. But once you knew the name, it surfaced occasionally through searches connected to Open Door donors, community partnerships, and the wider nonprofit world. That phrase began appearing often enough to bother me. The first time Iris noticed it, she closed the page without comment. Months later, Vivienne gave an interview connected to a philanthropic event. I would never have opened it if one of the organizations mentioned had not overlapped with the nonprofit network Iris worked in. Halfway through the article, I stopped. Vivienne was talking about survivor advocacy and communication. She referenced an anonymous story she had encountered through Open Door. A young survivor whose first spoken word after losing speech had been no. The journalist quoted Vivienne describing how deeply the story had affected her and how it reminded her that every survivor deserved a voice. I felt cold before I reached the end of the paragraph. Vivienne could not have known. The Open Door reflection contained no childhood history, no photograph, no surname. There was nothing connecting those words to the daughter Valerie had abandoned. She had found Iris's story without finding Iris. I called her downstairs. Iris read the interview standing beside me. Her face became completely still. I watched her eyes move back to her own anonymous line, then to Vivienne's words about giving survivors a voice. I expected anger. What appeared first was disbelief, not because Valerie had discovered her, because she had not. The woman who once called an 11-year-old broken for losing speech was now using that child's anonymous recovery story as evidence of her own compassion. Iris sat down. For several minutes, neither of us spoke, but those conclusions belonged to Iris first. She finally closed the article. Then she stood and walked toward the kitchen. Her life continued. That became the strangest thing about Valerie's reappearance. She could still hurt Iris. She could not stop her day. Years earlier, a doorbell could freeze her. Now, she could read something that reopened an old wound, take 20 minutes, and still leave for work. Resilience had become less dramatic and much more useful. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. But I wanted to understand how widely she had attached herself to survivor causes. I found another article from a previous philanthropic event. Then, one line caught my attention. Vivienne thanked several advisors, including someone described only as her longtime private advisor, M. Kerr. The name meant nothing to me. I kept reading. Farther down was another photograph. Vivienne stood at the center. Behind her, partly blocked by another guest, was a man. Not enough face to identify. A little older than the figure I had noticed in the earlier photograph. One hand behind his back, the other clasping the wrist. I enlarged the image. Pixels broke apart. My stomach reacted before my reason did. Damon. Then reason caught up. Maybe. Maybe not. Human beings repeat postures. Thousands of men clasped one wrist behind their backs. I had spent years expecting Damon to emerge from every shape I could not fully see. M. Kerr was not Damon Pierce. At least I had no evidence that he was. I closed the image. I did not mention the resemblance to Iris. There was nothing useful she could do with a blurry photograph and my old fear. The name stayed in my memory only because it had appeared beside Vivienne more than once. M. Kerr. Longtime advisor. A background figure who seemed to prefer remaining in the background. Around the same time, another name became more familiar to us for entirely different reasons. Warren Aldridge. Unlike Vivienne, Warren did not enter our lives through a photograph of my sister. He entered through Open Door. He had been one of the project's significant funders for years, the kind of donor whose support paid for programs without requiring his name to be printed across every room. Iris knew him only as someone connected to the financial side of work she cared about. At larger nonprofit events, his name appeared in donor acknowledgments. Occasionally he attended. Usually he did not. There was nothing in the material Iris or I saw connecting him to Vivienne Laurent. At the time, I was more concerned about the sentence Vivienne had borrowed. A few weeks after the interview, Iris and I were sitting at my kitchen table late in the evening. Elias had left after dinner. Iris had made tea and abandoned it until it was cold, a habit she had inherited from me despite years of claiming otherwise. The interview was still bookmarked on her laptop. I had assumed she had forgotten about it. She opened it again, read the paragraph, then clicked to the original anonymous Open Door story. Her own words appeared on one side of the screen. Vivienne's polished explanation of what those words supposedly taught her appeared on the other. I watched Iris move between them. The 11-year-old girl, who had once asked whether I would still want her if she could not speak, had grown into a young woman who helped other people communicate without apology. Yet now Vivienne was standing in elegant rooms, talking about voice as though she understood what it cost to find one. Her expression was not the same as when she had first discovered Vivienne Laurent years earlier. "She took 10 years from me," Iris said. "Now she's borrowing my words." By the summer of 2026, Iris was 21, and most days her voice was simply one part of her rather than the subject of the room. She spoke at work. She spoke with friends. She complained when I texted too many reminders, and laughed loudly enough at bad television that I could hear her from the kitchen. At Open Door, she mentored younger participants with the same patience other adults had once struggled to give her. Some days, If a room became too crowded or a memory arrived before she was ready for it, she stopped speaking for a while and used writing instead. Nobody in our house called that a setback anymore. If she needed silence, silence was allowed to be useful. One Saturday in early August, Elias was standing in my kitchen attempting pancakes. He had reached the stage in our relationship where he knew which cabinet held the flour, but still opened the wrong drawer for the spatula. We had been together long enough that his coffee mug had acquired a regular place beside mine, Vada's. Though he still had his own home, and I still corrected anyone who casually assumed we had combined everything. Iris came in wearing loose gray pants and an open-door t-shirt, her hair still pulled into the careless knot she slept in. She had spent the previous evening helping prepare materials for a youth mentoring workshop and looked as though she had negotiated with consciousness rather than willingly entered it. Elias set a pancake onto her plate. Calling it round would have required generosity. One side bulged outward while the other had folded in on itself. A narrow strip trailed from the edge like a damaged limb. Iris stared at it. Elias returned to the stove. She tilted the plate slightly, studying the pancake from another angle. "That looks injured." I almost inhaled coffee. Elias turned, looked at the pancake, then at her. He said the diagnosis was outside his specialty. Iris nodded gravely and reached for the syrup. Nothing about the exchange lasted longer than a few seconds, but I remember it because there had been a time when every sound Iris made felt precious enough to preserve. Now she could waste words on insulting breakfast. Elias had become part of our ordinary life, without trying to become its center. Sometimes he stayed for breakfast. Sometimes he left after dinner. He knew where I kept extra batteries, and which kitchen chair Iris considered hers, even though no formal law recognized that claim. If the garbage disposal jammed, he might help me fix it, but he was just as likely to hold the flashlight while I did it. He asked about Open Door because the work interested him, not because he was checking whether she was recovering properly. If she chose not to answer something, the subject ended. If she disagreed with him, he did not soften his opinion just because her history made conflict uncomfortable. One evening later that week, Elias and I were sitting behind my house, after Iris had left to meet friends. The Colorado heat had finally eased enough that the patio chairs no longer felt as if they had been stored inside an oven. The neighborhood was quiet except for sprinklers starting somewhere beyond the fence. We had been discussing something unimportant when Elias mentioned the future. He said he could imagine marrying me someday. The sentence landed more heavily than he intended. I was 44 years old. I had spent a decade constructing a family around evidence rather than promises. People stayed because they showed up Tuesday after Tuesday, not because they said forever on a Saturday. Valerie had taught me what promises could conceal. Damon had taught Iris something worse. Even after years with Elias, the word marriage made some old defensive machinery inside me wake up. I told him that formalizing a family still frightened me, because some part of me continued to associate promises with exits. Once a person was given the language of forever, my mind immediately began calculating what would happen when forever ended. Elias listened. He did not tell me I was being irrational. He only said he had wanted me to know what he could imagine. Then he let the subject go. I loved him more for not requiring an answer. I also hated how much that made me want to give him one eventually. While I was quietly failing to decide what marriage meant to me, Iris's life was becoming busier. She balanced work and continued education with her responsibilities at Open Door. Her role there had grown from alumni participation into mentoring and youth advocacy. The organization occasionally asked her to sit in on planning sessions because she had an irritating but useful habit of identifying the difference between what adults believed young people needed and what young people had actually requested. She came home from one meeting complaining that 3 professionals had spent 15 minutes discussing how to encourage independent communication without allowing the teenagers in the program to choose where to sit. It was through Open Door that Warren Aldridge's name became increasingly familiar. Early in 2026, The organization learned that Warren's private family office was planning a major charitable gift connected to his wedding later that summer. Rather than traditional gifts from certain guests and partners, part of the celebration would direct significant support towards several causes the couple cared about. Open Door was one of them. The wedding itself was extremely private. Most of us knew only that Warren was getting married somewhere in Colorado. That was why, when Open Door received a limited invitation for several alumni or program representatives to attend as honorees connected to the charitable gift, nobody in our house treated it as a family event. Iris was selected for one of them. She brought the news home folded inside the careful indifference she used whenever something secretly pleased her. She explained the invitation while unloading groceries, as if attending the wedding of one of Colorado's wealthiest businessmen were roughly equivalent to attending another fundraising lunch. She had earned the invitation through years of mentoring and work. She had not been chosen because of what Damon did to her. She had not been chosen because she lost her voice. She had been chosen because of what she contributed after getting it back on her own terms. The materials arrived electronically from Warren's family office and later in a formal packet. Security was tight because of the scale and privacy of the event. The documents contained the date, August 22, travel instructions, arrival times, identification requirements, the Boulder County location, transportation information, and clear restrictions about photographs and social media posting. The packet called it the Aldridge Wedding Weekend. It did not contain a glossy biography of the bride. I did not find that strange. Extremely wealthy people could make privacy into an administrative system, and the instructions had clearly been designed by professionals who believed guests required logistical information, not gossip. Iris Shaw, not Pierce. She had been using my surname for more than 3 years by then. To everyone processing guest credentials, it was simply the legal name of a 21-year-old Open Door mentor. But wealthy charity circles contained thousands of overlapping names. We had seen no public information connecting her romantically to Warren. His relationship was private enough that the ordinary material reaching Open Door had never identified the woman he planned to marry. If I had known, I would have told Iris. She would have decided whether to attend. But we did not know. Iris's first hesitation about the wedding had nothing to do with Valerie. She disliked being displayed as an example. She wanted to know whether the Open Door guests were expected to stand on stage and tell personal stories. The organization assured her they were not. The invited representatives would attend the celebration, be acknowledged with the charitable partners, and have opportunities to speak informally about the program if they chose. No one was required to narrate trauma for donors. That answer decided it. Iris accepted. When I asked whether she was excited, she gave me a look suggesting I had asked an embarrassingly maternal question. Then she spent 2 weeks deciding what to wear. Elias was included as my guest when arrangements were finalized around the Open Door group, which turned the practical planning into something strangely domestic. She said historical evidence should not be admissible forever. By the morning of August 22, the wedding felt less like a looming event than the end of a long series of logistics. Breakfast was light. Elias avoided pancakes. Still, something about that morning remains unusually clear in my memory. The sunlight through the kitchen window. Iris standing in front of the hallway mirror and changing earrings twice. Elias searching for his keys while they were already in his hand. My garment bag catching on the back door because I was trying to carry too many things at once. We looked like a family, preparing to attend somebody else's happy day. She brought her identification, her Open Door credentials, her phone, and a small bag containing things she had learned over 10 years, made stressful environments easier. The drive toward Boulder County carried us away from Denver into broader stretches of late summer landscape. The afternoon was warm and dry. The mountains sat blue-gray in the distance, softened by heat. Conversation came and went. Iris talked about one of the younger Open Door participants she had been mentoring. Elias complained about a driver who seemed personally committed to ignoring turn signals. I watched both of them and thought, with an uncomfortable tenderness, about the word family. I had spent years believing family was safest when it remained informal enough that nobody could weaponize a promise. Yet there we were, the woman I had raised, the man I loved. A car full of small arguments and shared history. Maybe labels were not what made something dangerous. Maybe people were. I was still thinking about that when we reached the estate. Security began before the main property came fully into view. Credentials were checked against the guest list. Our open door names were already in the system. Staff directed the nonprofit delegation toward a designated arrival area before we joined the larger flow of guests. The estate itself was beautiful in the deliberate way. Vast wealth can make beauty look effortless. The grounds opened toward distant mountain views. Mature trees provided shade around terraces and walkways. Floral arrangements had been designed to appear almost natural, until you looked closely enough to realize no wild garden had ever achieved that degree of coordination. People moved through the property carrying champagne and programs. There was music, but not yet the ceremony music. Open-door representatives were greeted by members of the wedding team and shown where the charitable partners would be acknowledged later. Warren's gift was discussed without anyone turning the moment into a sales pitch. Iris recognized two people from the organization and relaxed enough to move a little farther from me. I let her. At 21, she did not need her aunt attached to her shoulder because the guest list included billionaires. Elias and I followed at a comfortable distance. Then Iris stopped. Then I saw what she was looking at. Near the entrance to the ceremony area stood a formal display containing the printed wedding program and a large portrait of the couple. Warren Aldridge was immediately recognizable from open-door events and photographs. Beside him stood a woman, in an elegant pale dress. Vivienne Laurent, my sister. For several seconds, my mind refused to connect the two names, even while my eyes had already done it. The program beneath the portrait made the connection impossible to avoid. Warren Aldridge, Vivienne Laurent. The 22nd of August 2026. I looked at Iris. All color had left her face. She did not speak. Her silence did not frighten me immediately, because I had learned long ago that silence had more than one meaning. I stepped closer without touching her. She kept staring at the photograph. Vivienne looked polished, composed, almost serene. The image had captured the identity Valerie had spent years building. Survivor, entrepreneur, philanthropist, woman beginning a new life beside one of the wealthiest men in the state. No daughter visible anywhere in that story. Iris finally breathed out. Mom. The word was barely audible. For one confusing instant, some old part of me almost answered, because I had been Mom in her ordinary life for years. Then I understood. She was not calling me. She was naming the woman in the photograph. My first instinct was to get her out. I began scanning for the nearest route back toward the arrival area, already thinking about the car, the open-door coordinator, how little explanation we actually owed anyone. Elias did not move ahead of us. He looked at Iris, not the portrait. Iris's hand had tightened around the edge of her program. 10 years earlier, she had been 11 years old in a hospital bed, while Valerie decided that raising her would cost too much. Now Valerie was about to walk down an aisle toward a billionaire, while the daughter she had erased stood among the invited guests. I leaned toward Iris and told her we could leave immediately. She looked at me, then back at the portrait. I could see the old instinct returning, the one that said, disappearing was safer than occupying space someone else might resent. Before she could decide, movement across the estate caught my attention. A man was standing near one of the paths, leading toward the private wedding areas. He was too far away for me to see his face clearly at first. Older, heavier through the shoulders, hair changed by 10 years. But he was not looking at the flowers. He was not looking toward the ceremony. He was staring directly at us. One arm hung at his side, the other bent behind his back. His hand closed around the opposite wrist. My body recognized him before my mind allowed the name. Then he shifted just enough for sunlight to reach his face. Damon, 10 years older. Alive. Standing inside Valerie's billionaire wedding. And before I fully recognized him, I understood something worse. He had already recognized us. Damon had seen us first. For 1 second, none of us moved. The estate around us remained bright and orderly, full of flowers, polished glass, quiet music, and people speaking in the softened voices people use when they believe they have entered a beautiful day. Somewhere nearby, a server lifted an empty tray. Guests crossed the lawn toward the ceremony area. A woman laughed behind me. And across all of it, Damon stared at us. 10 years had altered him, without changing the part of him my body remembered. His hair was thinner and threaded with gray. His face had widened. The expensive dark suit made him look less like the man from the hospital and more like someone who belonged among donors, advisors, and private staff. But the posture was the same, one wrist held behind his back, calm arranged deliberately across his face. Iris had not seen him yet. She was still looking at the portrait of Valerie, beside Warren Aldridge. I turned slightly, placing my body between Iris and the direction of Damon, without thinking. The old instinct came back so fast it embarrassed me. Hide her, move her, decide first. I touched neither her arm nor her shoulder. Iris. She looked at me. I nodded toward a quieter path away from the ceremony entrance. She followed. Elias came with us without asking questions, until we reached a shaded terrace partly screened by tall ornamental grasses. From there we could still see pieces of the estate, but the portrait was gone from view. Iris pressed both palms against the stone edge of a planter. Her breathing was controlled but shallow. I told her we could leave. Immediately. No explanation required. No obligation was worth this. She closed her eyes and nodded. That was her first answer. Yes. For perhaps 30 seconds, our next steps seemed decided. I was already thinking through logistics. I could contact the open door coordinator. We could return to the vehicle. Someone else could represent the organization. Warren Aldridge did not need to know why one young woman had suddenly changed her mind about attending his wedding. Then Iris opened her eyes. She looked down at the open door badge clipped discreetly near her waist. Her name was printed beneath the organization's logo. Iris Shaw, not Iris Pierce, not Valerie's daughter, not Damon's victim. I watched something change behind her expression. She took out her phone and typed because speech, though still available, had become harder under the sudden strain. I read the screen. I was invited. I said yes. She typed again. Because of my work. Again, yes. Her thumb hovered over the screen. If I leave because she's here, she still gets to decide where I can be. That was the point where I nearly made the decision for her. Every frightened part of me wanted to say that leaving was not surrender, that safety mattered more than symbolism, that Damon was standing somewhere on this property, and I had no intention of giving him another chance to make her afraid. All of those things were true. None of them answered the actual question. What did Iris want? Elias stood a few feet away. He did not tell her staying would prove strength. He did not tell her leaving would be wise. He asked only one thing. What do you want? Iris looked back toward the lawn. For 10 years, adults had been learning to ask her that question before supplying the answer. The silence lasted long enough that I felt my own anxiety trying to fill it. I kept quiet. Finally, Iris typed again. I stay for open door. She paused. I do not go near her. Another pause. When that part is done, we leave. There was no revenge in it, no plan to expose Valerie, no wish to walk into the ceremony and destroy anything. Iris wanted to finish the obligation she had accepted before discovering who the bride was. That was all. I hated the decision. I respected it. Both things could exist together. We returned slowly toward the area where Open Door's guests were gathering. I began scanning the estate for Damon. He was no longer where I had seen him. That made me more uneasy than if he had remained visible. Iris noticed me looking. She did not tell me to stop. Neither did I. Displays described the organizations receiving support through the couple's wedding gift initiative. Open Door had been given a prominent position among them. I had seen donor language before. Most of it was carefully optimistic. Opportunity, community, access, hope. Then I saw the section devoted to communication and survivor support. The heading used the phrase, "Find your voice." I stopped reading for a moment. Below, it was language about Vivienne Laurent's belief that people recovering from fear and control deserved the freedom to communicate on their own terms. Iris stood beside me. Her face had gone hard. Then she saw the quote, not her name, not her photograph, just the anonymous line that had been circulating through Open Door materials for years. My first word back was no. I felt my stomach turn. There, at Valerie's wedding, the story of the daughter she had abandoned had become part of the decoration around the woman she pretended to be. The irony was almost too perfect to feel real. But nothing supernatural had put it there. Vivienne had read an anonymous Open Door story. She had liked what it said about survival. She had no idea the survivor was Iris. Now those words stood inside her wedding as evidence of her compassion. I looked at Iris. Years earlier, something like this would have shattered her for the rest of the day. Now she simply stared at the panel. Her breathing changed once. Then she said quietly, "Of course." The words carried no surprise, only disgust. She moved on. That was when I first heard someone call Damon by another name. A member of the wedding staff approached a man near one of the private access paths and said, "Mr. Kerr." I turned. Damon was standing with the coordinator holding a tablet. The staff member handed him something and continued speaking in the efficient tone of people solving event logistics. Mr. Kerr. My mind went immediately to the article. M. Kerr, Vivienne's longtime private advisor. The partly hidden man in the photographs. The hand behind the back. The wrist. I felt heat rise through my neck. It had been him, all along. The poor photographs had not been coincidence. The divorce had not meant what I had wanted it to mean. At least, not completely. Damon Pierce was standing inside Valerie's wedding, under a name everyone around him seemed to accept. I knew nothing yet about how or why that identity existed. I knew only what I could see. Staff treated him as someone with bride-side access. He was not a distant guest. He moved between private areas with familiarity. At one point, he checked something with a member of the coordination team, then stepped aside while another person passed. No one appeared nervous around him. That frightened me almost as much as seeing him. Iris noticed where I was looking. Her eyes found him. Her body went still. Not like the hospital. Not completely. She was 21 now. She had 10 years of experience recognizing what was happening inside herself. Her right hand closed around her phone. Elias shifted slightly nearer without touching her. Damon looked back at us. Then he smiled. Not warmly. Not broadly. A small acknowledgement. The expression of a man who had already begun deciding what our presence meant. I knew that look. Damon had always been most dangerous when he believed he understood everyone else's motives better than they understood their own. We had been on the estate less than an hour. Iris had not approached Valerie. She had not spoken to Warren. She had not mentioned Damon to staff. Yet I could see him watching us as though we had arrived carrying a weapon. That was his mistake. He could not imagine Iris existing near him without intending to challenge him. To Damon, silence had always been useful only when he controlled what it meant. Iris turned away from him. We joined the Open Door group. For the next 20 minutes, nothing happened. That was almost worse. A program director from Open Door reviewed when the delegation would be acknowledged. Iris exchanged a few words with another mentor. Guests continued arriving. Staff adjusted chairs. Somewhere behind the ceremony area, musicians tested a few notes. I kept expecting Damon. He did not come near us. Then I saw him speaking to the wedding coordinator. I could not hear the conversation. From my position, I saw only the way he angled his body slightly toward us, and the coordinator's eyes followed his glance. A few minutes later, he spoke to another staff member, wearing a discreet security earpiece. Again, no scene. No accusation shouted across the lawn. Just information moving quietly. That suited Damon. If he had marched toward us and demanded that Iris leave, people might have asked why. Instead, he was shaping the story before we were invited into it. A wedding staff member approached our open-door coordinator first. There was a brief conversation I could not hear. Then the coordinator looked toward Iris. My chest tightened. She came over and explained that wedding security needed to clarify something about our attendance. Her tone was confused, not alarmed. Our names were on the list. Our credentials had been checked. There should have been nothing to clarify. A security professional arrived a moment later with another staff member. They were polite. That mattered. Nobody grabbed Iris. Nobody treated us like criminals. The man explained that someone connected to the bride had raised a concern involving estranged relatives who might disrupt the ceremony. Because of the private nature of the event, they needed us to step away briefly while the situation was checked. Estranged relatives. I almost laughed. The phrase was so clean. It turned abandonment, abuse, disappearance, and 10 years of silence into a family disagreement. I asked who had made the claim. The security man did not identify anyone immediately. He simply repeated that they needed to verify the concern. Iris looked toward the open-door coordinator. The coordinator confirmed our invitation again. The security team acknowledged that. Nobody accused us of sneaking onto the property. This was not a guest list problem. It was a story problem. Someone had told them who we were before we had told them ourselves. I knew exactly who. My anger rose so quickly that for one terrible second, I almost did what I had spent 10 years learning not to do. I almost took over. I began explaining that Iris was invited independently, that we had no intention of disrupting anything, that the person making the accusation had a history they did not understand. Then Iris touched my wrist, very lightly. I stopped. She looked at me, not frightened yet. A reminder. Let me answer. I swallowed the rest of the sentence. The security professional turned toward her. He asked whether she knew the bride. Iris's mouth tightened. Yes. Her voice was soft but present. He asked whether there was any intention to approach her during the ceremony. No. Again, clear enough. I felt my shoulders lower slightly. This could still be resolved. The open-door coordinator confirmed that Iris had been selected as part of the delegation and had not requested access to the couple. The security man listened. He did not seem hostile. He seemed like someone trying to reconcile two incompatible accounts. Then Damon appeared at the edge of the group. He did not rush. Of course he did not. He walked toward us with the same controlled pace I remembered from the hospital. One of the staff members addressed him as Mr. Kerr. That name landed differently now that Iris heard it too. Damon stopped several feet away. His eyes moved from me to Elias, and finally to Iris. For a moment, nobody spoke. Iris had not stood this close to him in 10 years. I watched the effect travel through her before any sound reached her mouth. Her fingers stiffened around her phone. Her shoulders lifted slightly. The late summer air seemed suddenly too thin. The security professional looked at her again. He asked if she wanted to leave. Iris opened her mouth. Nothing happened. Her eyes widened slightly. She tried again. No sound. I saw the exact moment recognition reached her. Not surprised that a voice could fail. She had lived with that possibility for years. This was worse. Her body had recognized Damon before the rest of the room, understood why he mattered. The lawn disappeared from her face, the flowers, the music, the expensive guests. All of it fell away. For one terrible heartbeat, I saw the 11-year-old girl in the hospital bed again, watching a doorway and trying to produce a sound that would not come. The security man waited. Damon watched. Iris opened her mouth one more time. Nothing came out. The silence lasted only a few seconds before Damon used it. He turned toward the security staff in the measured tone I remembered from the hospital. To everyone around us, he was still Miles Kerr, a bride-side advisor with a legitimate event credential. He said Iris had a complicated history, sometimes became confused under severe stress, and would be better off leaving before the ceremony. Every sentence contained enough truth to make the lie harder to see. I saw the security professional's expression change. Not into suspicion exactly, into caution. Damon was giving him a frame that explained what he was seeing. A young woman who had been answering questions moments earlier and now could not speak. Damon had always understood the power of being the first person to explain another person's behavior. 10 years earlier, he had stood in a hospital hallway and called Iris confused before anyone understood what she had endured. Now he was doing it again. My anger broke through every lesson I had spent a decade learning. I started talking. I explained that Miles Kerr was not who he claimed to be. I said his real name was Damon Pierce. I said Iris had been hospitalized because of him when she was 11. I said Valerie Laurent was actually Valerie Pierce, my sister and Iris's biological mother. I began explaining that Damon had disappeared after the hospital and that Iris's inability to speak now did not mean a hand touched my forearm. Elias, not gripping, not pulling me away, just enough contact to make me notice how fast I was speaking. I looked at him. His attention was on Iris. That was when I saw what I was doing. Damon was explaining Iris. I was explaining Iris. Security was asking questions about Iris. And in the middle of all of us, she was becoming invisible again. I stopped. Every protective instinct I had wanted to keep talking until the entire estate understood exactly who Damon was. I wanted to surround Iris with enough truth that nothing he said could reach her. But protection could become another form of taking over. Elias moved closer to Iris, but not in front of her. He left a clear space between them. Her hands were trembling. Her phone remained locked inside one fist. Her breathing had shortened enough that I could see movement at the base of her throat. He asked one question. "Do you want me here?" Iris looked at him, then nodded. Damon gave a small exhale through his nose. "She's my daughter." The words turned my stomach. Biology had been absent from his responsibilities for 10 years, and suddenly useful as authority. Elias looked at him. "Then ask her who she wants standing beside her." Nothing in Elias's voice was aggressive. The security professional seemed to understand the distinction too. He shifted his attention away from Damon, toward Iris. He explained slowly that she did not have to speak. She could use her phone, write, gesture, or communicate through the open-door representative, if that was easier. They needed to know whether she wanted Meredith and Elias with her, while the situation was clarified. Iris stared at the man. Her fingers tightened. Then she unlocked her phone. Her first attempt at typing produced nothing coherent. Her thumb struck the wrong letters twice. She erased them. Nobody rushed her. That was the most important thing anyone did in those few seconds. They waited. I watched Damon watching them wait. He hated it. I knew, because I had seen him build power from urgency before. Decide now. Answer me. Stop making this difficult. Every delay gave another person time to understand they had a choice. Iris stopped typing. Instead, she raised one hand. Her signing had changed over the years, as spoken language returned, but the basic movements had never left her. She indicated me, then Elias, then made the answer clear. Them. The security professional confirmed what he understood. Iris nodded. That one movement changed the structure of the entire confrontation. Damon was no longer the relative speaking for an overwhelmed young woman. He was the man asking staff to remove an invited adult who had just chosen the two people she wanted beside her. The open-door program director arrived moments later, having been pulled away from the rest of the delegation when the confusion began. She carried her phone and an event packet, visibly irritated by the suggestion that Iris's attendance might somehow be unofficial. She confirmed everything. Iris Shaw had been selected by Open Door. Her name had been submitted properly. Warren Aldridge's family office had approved the delegation. Her credential had been issued through the same process as the other invited representatives. She had arrived through security normally. There had been no request by Iris for private access to the bride, groom, or restricted areas. The security professional checked the information against what he had. Another member of staff confirmed it electronically. I watched Damon's explanation begin shrinking. He had described unstable relatives who might disrupt the wedding. Instead, staff had an invited nonprofit honoree, standing quietly beside the people she had selected. Nobody accused Damon of lying yet. There were still facts they did not understand. But removal was no longer simple. Iris's hands were still shaking. The fact that the system had finally listened to her did not make Damon disappear. He stood close enough that she could see him without turning her head. I wanted someone to move him. Before I could ask, one of the security staff suggested the parties remain separated while they finished verifying the situation. Damon stepped back, but only a few feet. He adjusted the badge clipped inside his jacket. The movement caught my attention because the name printed there was visible for a moment. Miles Kerr, Bildseaviser. I had already understood that wedding staff knew him under that name. Seeing it printed made the deception feel more solid. Damon had not simply wandered onto the estate. Somebody had credentialed him. He belonged inside Valerie's present life, under a name that disconnected him from the man who had vanished from ours. Damon spoke quietly with the coordinator. I could not hear everything, but I heard him identify himself again as Vivienne's advisor and say that he had authority to raise security concerns involving her personal history. The coordinator checked something on a tablet. Another staff member scanned the badge. As Damon crossed between the general guest area and a bride-side coordination zone. The movement was ordinary event management, not special security clearance, but it left a record of where he had been. At the time, those details meant only one thing to me. Damon had access. He had built a place for himself inside Valerie's new life. I was still watching Iris. Her speech had not returned. That did not mean she had disappeared. She typed something to Elias. He read it and handed the phone back without sharing it. A minute later, she indicated that she wanted water. I brought it. She took 2 small sips. Her breathing eased. Damon watched all of it with the same thin impatience. Then he found another angle. He waited until the coordinator moved several steps away to confer with security. He did not come close enough to touch Iris. He knew better than that in front of staff. He only moved near enough that his voice could reach her without becoming part of the wider conversation. He said staying was a mistake. Iris's shoulders tightened. I moved toward her. Elias gave me one small glance. Wait, Damon continued. If Iris stayed, people would start asking questions. They would learn who she was. They would learn why she stopped speaking as a child. They would learn what happened inside his house. He did not threaten to hurt her. He offered shame. That had always been one of his cleaner weapons. He told her she had made an adult life for herself and should think carefully before reducing herself in front of strangers to the damaged little girl from years ago. Then he used Valerie's words. Not exactly. Close enough. Broken child. I saw the reaction in Iris before she moved. Her fingers shook harder. Her face drained. For a second, I thought Damon had found the lever he wanted. Iris looked down at her phone. She opened a blank note. The first few letters appeared slowly. Damon waited. He mistook the delay for fear winning. I knew because the smallest confidence returned to his posture. One hand settled behind his back. Iris finished typing. Then she turned the screen toward him. I read it over her shoulder. I built a life because I stopped protecting yours. Damon's expression disappeared. Not anger. For 1 second, nothing. The calm face had no replacement ready. Iris did not hold the screen up for the security staff. She was not performing the sentence. It was for him. Then she lowered the phone. Her hands were still trembling. That was what courage looked like in Iris. Not fearlessness. Not a speech delivered with perfect control. A shaking hand refusing to carry somebody else's secret. Damon stepped away. I expected him to leave us alone after that. Instead, losing control made him more determined to recover it. Losing control only made Damon press harder. He returned to the coordinator, repeated that he was acting on Vivienne's behalf, presented the Miles Kerr credential, and identified himself as her longtime advisor. Staff recorded the interaction, scanned the badge as part of ordinary event control, and cameras covered the path. A man who had spent years in the background was making himself increasingly difficult to overlook. The open-door director stayed close. She made it clear that if Iris chose to leave, the organization would support her. But nobody was removing her, simply because a bride-side advisor disliked her presence. The security professional handling us had become more cautious about Damon too. Not hostile, just less willing to accept his interpretation as fact. He asked again whether Iris wanted to remain. She nodded. No speech, no apology. A complete answer. Then a change moved through the estate. It began almost invisibly. Staff stopped circulating in random directions and started taking positions. Guests were encouraged toward their seats. The musicians shifted. The coordinator glanced at the time and spoke rapidly into an earpiece. The ceremony was about to begin. The security issue had not been fully resolved, but the wedding could no longer wait indefinitely, for a private family dispute nobody yet understood. The staff member nearest us asked that we remain where we were for the moment, away from the aisle but still within the guest area. Damon was instructed not to approach Iris again while they continued verification. His jaw tightened. He obeyed, not because he respected the boundary, because too many people were watching him now. Iris stood between Elias and me. Not behind us, between. Her phone remained in one hand. I could feel the faint tremor in her arm where it brushed mine. Then the music changed. The sound moved across the lawn and through the guests, like a signal everyone understood at once. Heads turned. Conversation fell away. Warren Aldridge stood waiting near the ceremony space. I had seen him only briefly before, but his face was unmistakable now. He looked toward the far end of the aisle, with the expression of a man who believed the next few minutes belonged to one future. Damon looked toward the entrance too. So did Iris. The bridal procession began. For a moment, Valerie was hidden behind flowers and people. Then she stepped into view. Vivienne Laurent entered smiling. The woman in the portrait. Elegant. Composed. Walking toward a billionaire beneath a charitable display built partly around the idea that every survivor deserved a voice. She looked toward Warren. Then her eyes moved across the guests. They reached us before she reached the aisle. I watched my sister see me. Then Elias. Then the young woman standing between us. Iris. Valerie stopped smiling. Her face changed so completely that for 1 second, she no longer looked like Vivienne Laurent at all. She looked like the woman who had walked out of a hospital 10 years earlier. Her smile disappeared before she reached the aisle. Valerie's smile disappeared before she reached the aisle. For several seconds, the ceremony continued around a bride who had stopped participating in it. The music carried on because the musicians could not immediately know why she had faltered. Guests shifted in their seats. Someone near the front turned to follow Valerie's line of sight. It led directly to Iris. I had spent years wondering what my sister would look like if she ever saw her daughter again. I had imagined guilt, shock, maybe grief. What crossed Valerie's face first was fear. Not fear for Iris. Fear of what Iris's existence meant inside the life Valerie had built. She recovered quickly. That was one of Valerie's gifts. I had watched her do it since we were young. Absorb embarrassment, rearrange her expression, become the version of herself the room expected. Vivienne Laurent returned before she took another step. She adjusted her posture and looked toward Warren. The music faltered only when someone near the ceremony entrance finally signaled the musicians to stop. Silence moved across the estate in pieces. Warren left his place at the front. He did not rush toward Iris. He went to his bride. From where I stood, I could not hear the first words between them, but I saw Valerie shake her head and gesture slightly toward the private side of the property. She wanted whatever this was removed from the ceremony before anyone could understand it. A wedding coordinator approached. So did one of the security staff who had already been dealing with us. The next few minutes did not become the public explosion people imagine when they hear that a wedding was stopped. There was confusion, instructions given quietly, guests being asked to remain where they were while a private issue was handled. Warren and Valerie moved several yards away from the central aisle toward a shaded edge of the ceremony area. Because security was already dealing with the question of our presence, Iris, Elias, and I were kept nearby rather than sent back into the crowd. Damon remained farther off, watching. For the first time since I had recognized him, he no longer looked entirely calm. Warren asked Valerie who we were. I heard enough of her answer. Estranged family. A painful chapter from before they met. People she had not been in contact with for years. She said Iris's presence was unexpected and inappropriate, but she still did not use the word daughter. I watched Warren look from Valerie to Iris. His face was not angry yet. It was analytical. He was trying to understand why his bride had stopped walking toward him, because of a young woman she was describing as little more than a distant relative. Valerie attempted to move the entire conversation somewhere private. She told the coordinator there was no reason to delay the ceremony and that security could resolve the matter separately. Warren did not move. He looked toward the security professional. The man summarized only what he actually knew. Iris Shaw was an approved open-door guest. The nonprofit had independently selected her. Her invitation was valid. A brideside advisor named Miles Kerr had raised a concern that she might disrupt the ceremony, but so far Iris had done nothing disruptive. Then Warren looked at Iris. Not at me. Not at Damon. At her. He asked who she was. Iris's fingers tightened around her phone. Her speech still had not returned. I could see her trying. Her throat moved. Nothing followed. Valerie saw it too. For the smallest instant, relief softened her face. That nearly broke something in me. 10 years earlier, Iris's silence had made Valerie's departure easier. Now, for one heartbeat, my sister seemed to believe silence might save her again. I stepped forward instinctively. Elias did not touch me this time. He did not need to. I remembered. This was Iris's answer. Not mine. Warren waited. The entire situation had narrowed to something almost unbearably simple. A powerful man could have demanded an immediate explanation. Security could have removed us to protect the schedule. Valerie could have been allowed to define her daughter before Iris found another way to communicate. Instead, nobody spoke for several seconds. Elias stood beside Iris, not in front of her. His voice was quiet enough that only those closest to us heard it. I'm listening. Iris closed her eyes. I watched her breathing. In, out, again. The hand holding her phone slowly relaxed. When she opened her eyes, she looked at Valerie. Not Warren. Not Damon. Her mother. Her lips parted. At first I thought the sound had failed again. Then I heard it. Barely above a whisper. You thought I would never speak. No one reacted theatrically. There was no gasp sweeping through the guests. The people nearest us simply became still. Valerie's face emptied. Iris swallowed. Speaking had cost her something physical in that moment. I could see it in the tension beneath her jaw, and the tremor returning to her fingers. She only looked at him and said that Vivienne Laurent was her mother. Warren turned toward Valerie. I will never forget the silence before she answered. She could have admitted it. She could have said that Iris was the daughter she had abandoned, and asked for the ceremony to stop while they dealt with the truth. Instead, she tried to reduce it. She said the relationship was complicated. She had been estranged from family during an abusive marriage. Years had passed. Circumstances had been painful. She implied Iris was connected to a period of her life she had already disclosed to Warren in broad terms. But she still avoided one clean sentence. That is my daughter. Warren asked whether Iris was, in fact, her child. Valerie's mouth opened. Iris stood perfectly still, then panic-defeated strategy. Riss, not here. The name crossed the space between them more effectively than any document could have. I felt it before I saw Warren understand. Riss, a private childhood nickname. The one Valerie had used in the hospital room when Iris was 11. The name I had almost forgotten until hearing it again made the years collapse. Valerie realized what she had said too late. Warren looked at Iris, then at Valerie. He did not need to know the nickname's entire history to recognize intimacy. A woman who had just tried to describe Iris as an estranged figure from a distant family past had addressed her with the instinctive name of someone who had once known her closely. Iris's eyes filled, but she did not look away. It destroyed Valerie's ability to pretend she barely knew the young woman standing in front of her. Warren asked how long Valerie had known Iris was her daughter. The question itself showed how badly the conversation had broken. Valerie began explaining, too quickly. She said she had never denied knowing her. She said the situation had been complicated by Damon. She said she had survived a dangerous marriage and had made choices she regretted. That was when Iris looked past her, toward the man standing near the brideside access path. Damon had begun moving backward. Not running. Not yet. Just repositioning. I saw Iris follow him with her eyes. Warren noticed, too. Iris raised one hand and pointed. Her voice was still fragile. That's him. Warren looked at the man everyone around him knew as Miles Kerr. Iris took another breath. Damon Pierce. For the first time that afternoon, Warren's composure changed completely, because he already knew it. Warren said Damon Pierce was her former husband. Valerie did not answer quickly enough. He looked again toward the man wearing the Miles Kerr credential. The same man wedding staff had been treating as her longtime private advisor. Something foundational had just broken. Valerie had apparently told Warren enough about her old marriage that the name Damon Pierce was familiar. She had not told him the supposedly vanished ex-husband would be standing at their wedding under another name, and she had not told him she had a daughter. 2 omissions, both now standing within eyesight. Warren did not turn to Iris and announce that he believed every accusation she might make. He did not need to. He had enough contradiction to stop proceeding. He asked Valerie one question that carried more weight than shouting would have. You told me he was gone. Valerie began to answer. Damon moved. The security staff noticed before I did. One person stepped toward him, not aggressively, but enough to indicate he should remain nearby, while identities were clarified. Damon said something about an urgent brideside matter and attempted to move toward one of the private pathways. His calm was fraying. The irony struck me later. If Iris had arrived intending to expose him, she could not have designed a better way to make him panic. But she had done almost nothing. She had simply stayed. Damon had created the rest. Warren looked toward the wedding coordinator and told her the ceremony was not continuing. There was no dramatic declaration that the marriage was permanently over. No public revenge speech. He said he could not marry Valerie, while facts this significant about her family history and the identity of a man in her inner circle remained unresolved. The distinction mattered. He was not convicting anyone. He was refusing to make a lifelong legal commitment while his understanding of the person beside him was collapsing. The coordinator acted immediately. Music remained off. Guests were quietly informed that the ceremony had been delayed because of a private matter. Staff began moving people away from the immediate area, rather than letting curiosity turn into a crowd. Iris did not look triumphant. She looked exhausted. The 2 sentences she had spoken seemed to have taken more from her than a 5-minute speech would have. I wanted to take her home. For the first time since arriving, I knew she wanted the same thing. Elias asked her quietly. She nodded. Before we could move, security was still trying to separate the overlapping issues. Our invitation had been confirmed. Valerie's relationship to Iris had become undeniable. Damon's identity remained unverified in any official sense, even though Iris and I knew exactly who he was. One staff member asked Damon to remain while they clarified his credential. He did not. Confusion had spread through the wedding party. Valerie was speaking with Warren and members of his team. Guests were being redirected. Staff, who had been positioned for a ceremony, were now solving a security problem no event plan had anticipated. Damon used the disorder. He moved toward a service-side path. By the time someone realized he was not returning to the area where staff had asked him to wait, he was already leaving the central estate grounds. Damon simply did what he had done 10 years earlier when consequences began closing around him. He left. The difference was that this time, disappearing was not the same as becoming invisible. Wedding security had his credential, Miles Kerr. His access points had been electronically logged. Multiple staff members had spoken directly with him. Cameras covered much of the controlled estate. His face had been recorded arriving, moving through brideside areas, presenting his badge, and attempting to have Iris removed. The wedding team had no reason to understand the importance of that yet. They simply preserved what they had, because a guest or advisor involved in a serious identity dispute had left when asked to remain available. Iris, Elias, and I were moved into a quiet, private room away from Valerie. Warren did not come in demanding Iris's story. His staff asked only what was necessary for immediate clarification. I gave Damon's full name, Damon Pierce. I explained that I had known him personally as my sister's husband and Iris's biological father. I said he had disappeared in 2016 after the hospital case. Iris confirmed the relationship without being asked to narrate the abuse. That was enough for the first check. What happened next did not unfold in 5 dramatic minutes. Names had to be compared. Information had to be passed through appropriate channels. A man known to wedding staff as Miles Kerr had to be connected to the identity Iris and I had supplied. I did not watch anyone type the magic search that solved everything, because there was no magic search. We waited. Iris sat beside me with both hands around a glass of water. Eventually, a member of Warren's security team returned. His manner had changed. He was careful about what he said because the matter was no longer simply a wedding disturbance. The identity information we had provided had produced a serious law enforcement concern. There was an old active matter connected to Damon Pierce, an arrest warrant tied to the abuse investigation that began after Iris's hospitalization had remained part of the legal record. No one told us the entire case was solved. No one said the financial questions surrounding Valerie had even been investigated yet. No one declared victory. The update was narrower, and for Damon, much worse. For 10 years, the man who believed controlling Iris's silence could keep him hidden had survived by staying difficult to locate and difficult to connect to the life he was living now. Then Iris walked into one wedding. He panicked. He used a credential. He identified himself repeatedly to staff. He walked through logged access points. He stood in front of security cameras. He made himself memorable to people whose names and roles were recorded, all because he could not tolerate Iris being allowed to remain in the same place. By the time we left the estate that night, the wedding had not happened. Valerie's carefully built identity had begun coming apart. But the first official update was not that some grand fraud had been exposed. It was something simpler. The man who had tried hardest to remove Iris had just left investigators the clearest modern trail to him in 10 years. Damon was not arrested at the wedding. That night, Iris came home with us. That was the only ending I cared about. She sat in the back seat beside Elias during the drive to Denver, her shoes off and her phone resting face down in her lap. She had not spoken again since identifying Valerie and Damon. Nobody asked her to. At one point, I looked at her through the rearview mirror and found her watching the dark highway behind us. For a second, I remembered the 11-year-old who had watched mirrors after leaving the hospital. Then Iris noticed me looking. She raised one hand and gave me a small, tired thumbs up. I looked back at the road. That was enough. The next morning, the wedding existed in pieces across my kitchen table. The world had a strange habit of reducing life-changing events to objects you could accidentally spill coffee on. We gave the information authorities requested. I explained again who Damon Pierce was, how I knew him, what had happened after Iris's hospitalization in 2016, and why I had immediately recognized the man called Miles Kerr. Iris chose how much she wanted to participate. That choice mattered to me more than whether she spoke. The old abuse investigation did not suddenly depend on a 21-year-old woman reconstructing every terrible detail of childhood for strangers. Evidence had been preserved when she was 11. Medical records existed. Child protection material existed. Statements and investigative work from that time existed. Damon's flight had not erased them. The wedding had done something much narrower. It told authorities where the missing man had re-entered the world. Within days, investigators had more current information than they had possessed in years. Still, it took time. A week passed, then another. Every unknown number made my stomach tighten, though Iris seemed less interested in the chase than I was. That surprised me until I understood why. For me, Damon was still unfinished danger. For Iris, he had already lost something more important at the wedding: authority over what she meant. He had stood in front of strangers and tried to define her silence, and the room had waited for her instead. Several weeks after the wedding, we were informed that Damon had been located and taken into custody through ordinary law enforcement work, connected to the outstanding warrant and the new identification information. I expected relief to feel explosive. It did not. I was standing at my kitchen counter when I received the call, then hung up. Iris was at the table working on open-door materials. I told her. She stopped moving for several seconds. Then she exhaled. She nodded and returned to the page in front of her. That was the moment I finally understood that arrest was not the climax of her life. The person Damon had harmed most had already built years that did not belong to him. What followed grew larger than the abuse case. Not because Iris had exposed a financial conspiracy with one sentence at a wedding. She had not. The financial investigation developed independently once people began examining the identities and relationships surrounding Damon and Valerie. Warren's attorneys cooperated. So did people connected to his family office. Months later, I learned more about what Warren had known before August 22. He had not married a woman whose past nobody had checked. His people knew Vivienne Laurent had once been Valerie Pierce. They knew she had been married to Damon Pierce. They knew there had been a difficult history around that marriage. Valerie had presented herself as someone who had escaped an abusive husband, rebuilt her life, and permanently separated herself from him. That story had contained enough truth to survive scrutiny. The divorce was real. Damon had been dangerous. Valerie had, at times, been afraid of him. The lie was hidden in what she said those facts meant. Warren's due diligence work had also encountered small anomalies around a recurring advisor and certain business relationships. Nothing strong enough, standing alone, to prove criminal conduct. A name appearing here. A connection that seemed indirect there. People around Vivienne who were difficult to place cleanly. M. Kerr had been one of those shadows. Before the wedding, There had been no reason for Warren's people to conclude that a private advisor called Kerr was the ex-husband Vivienne claimed had vanished from her life. Then Iris pointed across the estate and said Damon Pierce. One corrected identity changed the meaning of information that already existed. Iris connected them by recognizing her own father. After that, investigators did the work that evidence requires. We were not given every detail while the investigation was active, nor should we have been. What I learned came gradually through attorneys, investigators, later public proceedings, and information that became part of the record. At least 3 earlier wealthy victims emerged, whose relationships with Valerie and the network around her had ended with major unexplained losses. But once investigators stopped treating Damon and Vivienne as unrelated to each other, patterns became harder to dismiss. Records showed they had remained connected after the divorce. Somewhere along the line, the frightened wife had also become an active participant in the machinery they built together. Communications and financial evidence showed both of them benefiting from deceptions directed at wealthy people who believed they were dealing with legitimate relationships, opportunities, or arrangements. The documented losses eventually exceeded $6 million. That distinction protected Iris from something I had feared since the wedding. She did not become responsible for what happened to Valerie and Damon afterward. She told the truth about who they were. Other people decided what that truth legally meant. The strangest discovery involved Open Door. Warren's people eventually traced the decision-making around the charitable component of the wedding. I learned about it later through counsel, after enough of the matter had become safe to discuss. She had read the anonymous alumni story about someone whose first returning word after losing speech was no. Iris's story. The same sentence Valerie later repeated publicly. My first word back was no. Exactly the qualities she wanted, attached to the identity she had created. She encouraged Warren to make Open Door one of the causes, highlighted through the wedding gift. That recommendation helped lead Warren's family office to invite Open Door representatives. Open Door then selected Iris Shaw because of the work she had earned the right to represent. Valerie had spent 10 years removing her daughter from her biography. Then she unknowingly helped send her an invitation. The mother who borrowed Iris's voice had used it to bring Iris directly into the room where the lie depended on her absence. By 2027, the investigations had become court cases. There was no reason to turn our lives into permanent seating outside courtrooms, just because Damon and Valerie were finally being forced to answer for theirs. Damon faced the viable abuse case that had begun years earlier, supported by contemporaneous evidence preserved when Iris was a child, along with fraud-related conduct supported by the later investigation. Her legal exposure centered on the fraud conspiracy she had actively participated in as an adult, and on other concealment-related conduct only where the evidence supported it. What Valerie had actually done was enough. By early 2028, the proceedings had resulted in substantial incarceration for both of them. I never memorized the numbers as if years in prison could be converted into years returned to Iris. There were also financial consequences tied to the fraud, restitution obligations, forfeiture of assets and proceeds where the courts found legal grounds, and the collapse of the polished social position Vivienne had spent years constructing. Warren ended the relationship. He preserved records, protected his own interests, cooperated with investigators, and moved on with his life. That was enough. I respected him more for not turning Iris into another charitable project. Valerie tried to contact Iris before the cases were fully resolved. Iris ignored the first attempts. Then, eventually, she agreed to receive one written explanation. She read it at my kitchen table. Valerie acknowledged that Damon had controlled and frightened her during parts of their marriage. She described how fear had narrowed her choices until survival became something she measured one day at a time. I believed that part. So did Iris. Nothing required us to rewrite 2016 as if Valerie had never been a victim herself. But the letter kept trying to use one truth to excuse another. It did not explain turning her daughter into a blank space while building a public identity around survivor advocacy. Iris chose to answer once. She did not ask me what to write. That may have been the moment I understood most clearly how far we had come. At 11, she needed me to promise she could stay. At 22, she did not need me to translate her own history. Her response was short. "You were afraid of him. I was 11. You still chose who had to pay for that fear." She sent it. There was no forgiveness attached. No demand for another explanation. No promise that reconciliation might happen later. Iris could recognize that Valerie had once been harmed without allowing Valerie to use that harm as ownership of Iris's future. She never asked to confront Damon. I was grateful. There was nothing he could say that Iris needed. For years I had imagined closure as an answer. I finally learned it could also be the decision to stop asking a person who hurt you to explain why you mattered so little to them. By then, the legal story was ending. Ours was becoming ordinary again. That was where I wanted to live. One morning months later, I was upstairs looking for a blouse. I was certain the dry cleaner had lost, even though it was hanging directly behind another shirt. Elias was downstairs making coffee. Iris had stayed over because she had been helping with an open door event late the night before. I heard drawers opening in the kitchen, then footsteps, then Iris's voice. "Dad, have you seen my keys?" Everything in the house stopped, at least for me. Elias stood beside the counter holding his coffee. I could see him from the stairs. He froze. Iris was halfway through checking her bag when she realized what she had said. She looked up. Nobody moved for one ridiculous second. Then Elias answered. "Kitchen counter." Iris glanced toward the keys. They were exactly where he said. She looked back at him. "You heard me." Elias's face changed in a way I had never seen before. Not dramatic, just open. "I always do." I had to sit down on the stairs. Iris rolled her eyes when she noticed me crying. That helped. She had never called Elias dad at the billionaire wedding. She had not needed to crown him publicly as the good father, while Damon stood there as the bad one. The word came months later because she needed her keys. That was why it belonged to Elias. Not as a reward for rescuing her. As the name for a man who had become ordinary enough to ask where she left things. Something in me changed that morning too. I had spent years believing family was safest when no one made promises large enough to betray. Elias had never forced me to confront that belief. Iris did. Not intentionally. One evening, she found me staring at the small ring Elias had eventually given me, after asking whether I might someday be ready for the future we had discussed. I told her the truth. I loved him. I wanted the life. I was still afraid of what happened if people changed. Iris listened. Then she reminded me of something I had spent years teaching her. Fear was information. It was not always instruction. Being afraid Elias could leave was not the same thing as knowing he would. I had told Iris for years that Damon did not get to decide which rooms she entered. Yet I had allowed Damon and Valerie's marriage to decide what marriage meant in my own life. The contradiction became impossible to ignore. So I said yes. Not because I finally learned how to guarantee forever. Nobody can. I said yes, because Elias had spent years showing me that commitment was not control, and dependence was not surrender. On the 20th of May 2028, we married. It was small, painfully small by billionaire wedding standards. No private estate. No security credentials. No carefully engineered philanthropic message. No public reinvention. We had family, friends, people from Open Door, a few colleagues, flowers that did not require a design team, and food that Iris insisted was more important than matching napkins. She was 23. She stood beside me while I got ready and complained that I had asked whether my earrings looked right 4 times. I told her this was traditionally considered emotional support. She said she would research that claim. When we walked into the ceremony, Nobody had to wonder whether the people standing beside us were telling the truth about who they were. Elias looked at Iris before he looked at me. She smiled. Not the careful smile she once used when adults were watching. Her real one. The one that had begun years earlier, as a laugh escaping because a no card was stuck to a psychologist's shoe. I thought about the hospital. A blanket pulled to a frightened child's chest. Footsteps in the hallway. A mouth opening without sound. A mother walking away. A notebook. If I can't talk, will you still want me? I had answered yes, before I understood what yes would cost. Years later, I knew the cost had never been the important part. The important part was that Iris eventually stopped asking the question. She knew. After the ceremony, people gathered outside in the mild May afternoon. Someone lost a phone. Someone spilled a drink. Elias forgot where he had put the envelope containing one of the vendor payments, and Iris informed him that becoming her father had clearly damaged his organizational skills. He blamed age. She blamed the pancake. I stood watching them argue, and understood that this was the ending I had wanted without knowing how to name it. Not Valerie destroyed, not Damon imprisoned, not a billionaire wedding stopped. Those things were consequences. This was the victory. A young woman who had once believed love depended on being easy to keep now, spoke when she wanted, wrote when she wanted, went silent when she needed, laughed without measuring the sound, and belonged to people who did not require any version of her except the one she chose to be. The first family Iris was born into taught her that telling the truth could cost her a home. The family she chose taught her that home was the place where her voice never had to ask permission to exist.